The sky was still pale when I pulled into the small parking lot just off the winding dirt road. The air smelled sharp and clean, like pine needles and damp earth mixed with the faint scent of campfire smoke from other sites nearby. It was early spring, and the forest was waking up from its winter slumber, though it still felt cold beneath the thin layers I wore. My car door creaked as I got out, the sound swallowed quickly by the quiet of the woods. I had come here alone to camp for a few days, craving the kind of silence you don't find in the city, the kind of quiet that fills your ears and pushes you to listen to yourself think. The campsite was simple, a small clearing surrounded by tall, straight trees that seemed to stretch forever upward. Their bark was rough and gray, with patches of moss growing in the cracks. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. I picked a spot near a large rock that looked like a natural seat and started unloading my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, backpack with food and water, a small stove, and my flashlight. I wanted to keep things minimal, nothing fancy, just what I needed. Setting up the tent took a while. The stakes were stubborn in the rocky soil, and the wind pushed against the fabric as I tried to get everything tight and secure. It was a chill morning, and I could see my breath in the air. The sun was creeping higher now, golden light filtering through the branches and casting long shadows on the ground. I finished pitching the tent, then laid out my sleeping bag inside, smoothing it flat. I felt a calmness settle over me, a welcome break from the noise and rush of everyday life. After unpacking, I decided to explore the immediate area. The forest was dense just beyond the clearing, the underbrush thick with brambles and young saplings. I followed a narrow trail marked by faint footprints and broken twigs, my boots crunching softly over dry leaves. The smell of pine and damp earth was stronger here, and I heard the occasional chirp of birds and the distant rustling of small animals. The air was crisp, with a slight breeze that whispered through the branches. It felt peaceful but also a little eerie, like the woods were watching, waiting. I walked for almost an hour, keeping the campsite in sight in case I needed to return quickly. The trail wound along a small creek, its water clear and cold, running over smooth stones and fallen branches. I knelt down to cup some water in my hands and took a slow sip, feeling the cold liquid slide down my throat. I filled my bottle, then continued following the path. The sun was higher now, and the light made patterns on the forest floor as it sifted through the leaves. When I got back to camp, I built a small fire with dry twigs and branches I had gathered. The flames crackled and popped, casting a warm glow against the darkening forest. I heated some water for soup and ate quietly, watching the fire dance. The woods grew darker around me as the sun set, shadows stretching long and deep. The temperature dropped sharply, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. Night in the forest feels different than in town. It's alive with sound, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. I lay back in my sleeping bag and stared up at the stars visible through the gaps in the trees. The sky was clear, and the constellations looked sharp and bright. I felt small but oddly connected to something larger, a part of the natural world that most people forget. Sleep didn't come easily. The forest sounds seemed louder close up, and every noise made me tense. A branch cracking underfoot, an animal moving through the brush, the hoot of an owl somewhere distant. I kept checking my flashlight and my knife, small comforts against the unknown. The wind picked up and whispered through the trees, shaking branches above my tent, and I wondered what might be out there, just beyond the thin walls of fabric. In the middle of the night, I woke to a sharp sound, something heavy, thudding against a tree not far from my tent. My heart raced as I stayed very still, trying to listen. The noise came again, slow and deliberate, like something large was moving carefully but purposefully. I had no idea what it was. I stayed quiet, hoping it would move on. After a long moment, the sounds faded, replaced by the usual chorus of night creatures. I lay awake for hours after that, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it a bear? A deer? Something else? The idea that something was so close, out there in the dark, made me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. I told myself I was being silly, that I was safe inside the tent, but the fear lingered. Morning came slowly, the pale light creeping in again through the trees. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, feeling the cold air hit my face. The forest looked calm and still in the early light, but the ground around my tent showed signs of disturbance. Crushed leaves, broken twigs, and something else. There were large, deep tracks in the mud near the creek, not quite like any animal I recognized. They were too big for a deer, too irregular for a bear. I felt a chill run down my spine as I studied the prints. They led away from the creek, deeper into the forest. I debated whether to follow them, curiosity battling caution. I didn't want to stay in camp all day, but I also didn't want to get lost or stumble on whatever had made those tracks. I decided to follow the prints carefully, keeping the campsite in sight when I could. The forest seemed denser here, the light dimmer under the thick canopy. The air was moist and heavy, smelling of wet leaves and moss. The tracks were hard to follow in places where the ground was rocky or covered in dry leaves, but I kept looking for them. After walking for almost 2 hours, I came to a small clearing I hadn't seen before. The sunlight was weak here, filtered through thick branches. In the center of the clearing was a pile of branches and leaves arranged roughly like a shelter, but it looked abandoned and broken. I circled it slowly, my eyes scanning for anything unusual. Nearby, I spotted more tracks, smaller like those of a person, but they were faint and partially erased by wind and rain. I realized then that someone else had been here recently. The idea unsettled me. I wasn't alone in these woods, and whoever was here might not be friendly. I hurried back toward the campsite, my heart pounding. The forest seemed less inviting now, shadows deeper and more threatening. I tried to keep calm, telling myself I was just imagining things. When I reached the clearing where I had left my tent, relief washed over me. Everything looked the same except for one thing: my backpack was gone. Panic hit me hard. I searched frantically, looking behind trees, under leaves, anywhere I could. It was no use. My food, my stove, my extra clothes, all gone. Someone had taken it while I was away. The forest suddenly felt cold and dangerous. I packed up the tent as fast as I could, trying not to make noise. I didn't want to stay another minute. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife and headed for the car, taking the fastest route back the way I came. The walk felt longer, every sound making me jump. I stayed alert, glancing behind me often, but I didn't see anyone. When I finally reached the parking lot, I locked my car doors and sat inside, catching my breath. I called for help and told them what happened, giving my location. The officer said they would send someone to check the area, but warned me to stay in my car until help arrived. The thought of spending another night out there alone was terrifying. Hours later, a ranger showed up. We drove slowly through the woods, looking for signs of whoever had been there. They found some footprints and pieces of my gear abandoned near a dirt road, but no person. The ranger said that the forest was full of hikers and campers, and sometimes people would take things left unattended. It wasn't the first time. I felt shaken but grateful to be safe. The forest that had seemed so peaceful and welcoming in the daylight had revealed a darker side, one filled with unknown dangers and people who didn't respect the quiet or the solitude. I left that night, the forest growing silent again behind me. I didn't camp alone after that. I learned that nature isn't just about beauty and calm. It's unpredictable and wild, full of things you can't always see or understand. But I also learned that sometimes, the best thing you can do is trust your instincts and know when to walk away. The experience stayed with me long after I left those woods, a reminder that being alone, even in the most beautiful places, carries risks. But it also taught me something important about respect, for the land, for other people, and for the quiet power of nature. I keep that lesson close now in every camping trip I take, knowing that some parts of the forest are better left unexplored alone. I parked my truck on the side of the dirt road where the trees started thickening and the gravel began to fade under patches of moss and dead leaves. The forest was quiet, with the kind of stillness that presses against your skin and reminds you how far away from everything you really are. I stepped out and stretched my legs, looking down the narrow trail that wound deeper into the trees. It was late September, just cool enough for a jacket in the evenings, and I wanted one last camping trip before winter. I had picked this spot from a topographic map and satellite images online. It wasn't in any park, just a patch of state forest far from any towns. No marked trails, no campsites, no facilities. Just raw woods. That's how I liked it. I wanted silence and distance from other people, and I usually got it by hiking off-trail to places no one else bothered to go. I slung my pack over my shoulder, locked the truck, and started walking. The trail was faint, probably used by deer more than people. The ground was uneven, full of roots and small rises, and the trees grew tighter the deeper I went in. I had about 4 miles to go to get to the little clearing I had spotted on the map. A small flat section near a stream, surrounded by a thick wall of pine. The hike was slow. I had to stop often to check my bearings and make sure I was still heading in the right direction. I didn't see any other footprints, no signs of other people, just deer tracks, the occasional squirrel darting through brush, and a crow that watched me from above for a while before flying off. After about 2.5 hours, I reached the clearing. It was exactly as I had hoped, flat, dry, and shielded by tall pines that swayed gently in the breeze. There was a mossy log at the edge and a narrow stream about 20 yards away with clear, cold water running over smooth stones. I dropped my pack, caught my breath, and looked around slowly. The air smelled like pine needles, damp dirt, and clean water. I set up my small tent under a thick tree, laid out my sleeping bag, and got a fire going with dry sticks I had gathered. I boiled water for coffee, ate a pack of trail mix, and sat back against my pack as the sun dipped low. The light shifted from gold to orange, casting long shadows between the trees. The air cooled quickly. I pulled on a sweatshirt and fed the fire. I stayed up until the sky turned black and stars filled the gaps between branches. No planes, no distant hum of roads, just the crackle of fire and the occasional rustle from some small animal passing through. I felt calm, far from anything that could bother me. Eventually, I put out the fire, zipped up the tent, and crawled into my bag. That first night passed without anything strange. I slept hard and woke just after dawn, stiff from the cold and the hard ground. The morning air was foggy and cold. I made coffee again and watched the mist roll over the stream. The woods were quiet except for birds starting their day. I decided to do some exploring. I packed a small day bag with a knife, compass, some snacks, and a water bottle, and headed east through the trees. I didn't plan to go far, just wanted to get a better sense of the land. I found a few deer trails and followed one up a ridge where I got a view through the trees of a wide hollow below. It was beautiful and untouched. No trash, no old fire rings, no signs anyone had been there in years. But coming back down, I noticed something that didn't feel quite right. About 100 yards from my camp, I saw a tree with fresh bark gouged off in long vertical lines. At first I thought it might be from a bear, but there were no claw marks, just deep scrapes, like someone had taken a hatchet or a machete to the trunk. I stood there for a while looking at it. The marks were clean, sharp, and recent. The wood underneath was still damp and bright. I hadn't passed that tree on my way in, so I couldn't say for sure if it had been like that yesterday, but it didn't sit right. There were no other trees like it around, just that one, standing there with its bark stripped in 2 deep, straight cuts. I circled around a bit more, eyes open now, and found another tree not far away with similar marks. This one had 3 cuts, lower to the ground, maybe knee height. Again, fresh. Again, just that one tree. No pattern, no obvious trail, just random scars on a few trunks. I made my way back to camp slowly, scanning the trees as I went. Every little noise made my ears perk up, but I didn't see anything else. I got back and checked over my stuff. Everything was where I left it, nothing missing. The fire pit was undisturbed. The tent was still zipped. I spent the afternoon close to camp, mostly gathering more wood and sharpening a stick to use as a poker. I didn't see anyone. No voices, no movement in the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been out there. Maybe a hunter marking trails? But there were no ribbons or signs, no blinds or tree stands. And it was bough season anyway, no reason for anyone to be out here hacking trees. That night, I kept the fire going longer. I ate a hot meal and sat close to the flames. I didn't hear anything unusual, but I didn't fall asleep easily. I kept listening. At some point after midnight, I finally dozed off. I woke up suddenly. It was still dark. I didn't know what time it was. The woods were silent, completely still. No wind, no animals, just a dense, heavy silence. I sat up slowly and reached for the flashlight. I clicked it on and unzipped the tent. Nothing. The fire had burned down to coals. My pack was still next to the log. The woods were still, but there was something, a sound, faint, behind the silence, like fabric moving or maybe leaves shifting under something light. It came from the other side of the clearing. I held the light steady and scanned the trees. Nothing moved. I stayed there, barely breathing, trying to pick out shapes in the dark. I must have stood like that for 10 minutes, just listening. Finally, the silence broke. A single sharp crack, like a twig snapping under weight. Not close, but not far either. Maybe 50 feet into the trees. I aimed the light again, saw nothing, and stepped backward into the tent, pulling the zipper slowly and keeping the flashlight aimed forward through the mesh. I didn't sleep again. I lay there, eyes open, heart pounding. I listened until the sky lightened and the birds started again. When I stepped out, I checked the perimeter of the camp. I found a footprint, a single boot print in the dirt near the stream. Not mine. It was angled toward the trees, as if whoever made it had been standing still, watching the camp. I didn't pack up right away. I needed to think. Could have been a hiker, a hunter, someone who had as much right to be here as me. But I didn't like the silence, or the mark on the tree, or that single footprint perfectly clear. I stayed one more night. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to spook myself. Maybe I didn't want to admit something was off. I reinforced the tent, sharpened the ends of 2 sticks, and kept them by the fire. I ate a cold dinner and didn't light the fire after dark. I wanted to see more than be seen. That night was colder and darker. The clouds covered the stars, and there was no moon. I sat just inside the tent with the flap open, flashlight off, wrapped in my sleeping bag, listening. Hours passed. Then I heard it again, the soft shuffle of something moving through leaves. A slow, quiet step. Then another, closer this time. I held my breath and leaned slightly to the side. My eyes had adjusted. I could just make out the edge of the clearing. And then I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the tree-line. Still, watching. It didn't move. Not at first. Just stood there. I couldn't make out the face. Just a silhouette. Broad shoulders. Arms at the sides. No flashlight. No headlamp. No visible pack. It stood for a long time. I didn't move. I barely blinked. Then, slowly, it turned and walked away. No rush. Just a quiet retreat into the trees. I waited until dawn. The figure never returned, but I didn't sleep at all. As soon as there was enough light to see clearly, I packed everything fast. I barely ate. I didn't clean up the camp. I threw everything in my pack, rolled the tent without folding it, and started hiking. I didn't take the route I came in on. I looped wide around the area where I had seen the footprint. I moved fast and stopped often to listen. I didn't see or hear anything else. When I got back to the truck, I stood there for a while, scanning the woods behind me. There were no other vehicles, no tire tracks, nothing disturbed, just my truck, sitting where I left it, surrounded by thick, silent trees. I didn't tell anyone about it when I got home. It felt like something that wouldn't make sense if I tried to explain it. I didn't want people thinking I was imagining things. Maybe I was. Maybe the figure was just a tree, or a shadow, or a trick of tired eyes in the dark. But I know what I saw. I know how still it stood. I know it was watching me. And I know that if I had lit the fire that night, it might have come closer. I haven't camped alone since. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the dense line of pine trees as I pulled off the main road onto the narrow dirt path leading to the campsite. It was a small, lesser-known spot that few people talked about, and that was why I picked it. I wanted to be alone. away from the noise and rush of the city. The air was crisp, fresh with the scent of pine and earth, and there was a slight chill that hinted at the coming night. I parked the car at the small clearing at the end of the trail. It was a quiet spot, surrounded on 3 sides by thick woods, and on the 4th by a slow-moving river that reflected the fading light. I grabbed my gear, a tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, a small stove, and some food I packed, and set off toward the spot I had scouted on my map earlier that day. It was maybe 100 yards into the forest, near a cluster of old birch trees leaning over a patch of soft moss. The ground was uneven, scattered with roots and rocks, and the smell of damp leaves and pine needles was strong. The sun had almost disappeared now, and the last rays filtered through the branches in long, slanting beams. I worked quickly to set up the tent. The fabric was thin, but the brand promised it would hold up against moderate weather. I hammered the stakes into the ground, careful not to disturb too much of the forest floor. Felt strange to be so isolated, yet peaceful. No sound but the occasional chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves. Once the tent was up, I gathered some dry wood for the fire. The forest was dense, but there were dead branches scattered around, perfect for kindling. The air was cooler now, and the dampness began to settle in as twilight deepened. I arranged the wood carefully, struck a match, and soon the fire was crackling, casting flickering shadows on the trees around me. The warmth was comforting. I cooked a simple meal, instant noodles and canned beans heated over the stove, and ate slowly, listening to the forest sounds grow louder as the night settled. Somewhere not far off, I heard the faint call of an owl. The firelight danced over the tent fabric, and the crackling wood was the only steady sound in the stillness. I lay back on my sleeping pad, staring up at the mesh ceiling of the tent, through which I could see the stars beginning to appear. After some time, the fire died down to glowing embers, and I made sure to put it out properly. The night was cold, sharper than I had expected. I zipped myself into the sleeping bag and tried to relax, but the silence around me started to feel heavy, almost like it was watching. Couldn't sleep. The forest seemed too alive for rest. Every small sound, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the distant splash of water, was sharper in the dark. My mind wandered to the stories I'd heard about people getting lost or running into trouble out here. No ghosts or monsters, just the raw danger of being alone in the wild. Hours passed. I tried to calm myself by focusing on breathing, but then I heard it. A faint crunching noise, like footsteps on dry leaves, coming from just beyond the tent. It wasn't close enough to be sure, but it was steady and slow. Someone was out there, walking through the woods near my camp. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained my eyes toward the darkness. The sound stopped suddenly. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing else came. The silence returned, heavier than before. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but it didn't sound like any animal I knew. I had been camping enough times to recognize the difference. This was a human. I stayed awake, alert to every noise. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The slow, careful footsteps crunching through the leaves, circling the camp, then stopping right on the edge of the clearing. It was too close for comfort. I could barely breathe. I thought about shouting or making noise, but I didn't want to give away my exact location. I had no idea who or what was out there. The woods were too dark, too thick to see more than shapes and shadows. My phone was almost dead, and I had no cell signal. The footsteps moved away, slowly retreating into the dark. I stayed quiet, heart racing, for what felt like hours. Morning seemed impossibly far away. When the first light finally broke through the trees, I slipped out of the tent, careful not to make a sound. The forest looked peaceful in daylight, sunlight warming the moss, birds singing in the branches, but I felt raw and exhausted. I packed up quickly and started walking back toward my car, eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. As I neared the clearing where I had parked, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the ground near the edge of the clearing, someone had left a crude arrangement of sticks and stones. It wasn't random. It looked like a warning or a marker. The stones were arranged in a circle, and the sticks pointed toward the tent site. I didn't stop. I hurried to the car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. The road back to civilization felt like a lifeline. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me through the trees. Back in the safety of my apartment, I checked the news and local reports. Nothing strange was reported around the area. No missing persons, no criminal activity, no accidents. But I knew what I heard. Someone had been watching me, circling the camp at night, close enough to make me feel hunted. I haven't gone back to that spot since. I still go camping, but I stick to busier, more open sites where I can see other people and where help is near if I need it. That night reminded me how vulnerable you can be out in the woods, where no one can hear you if something goes wrong. There were no ghosts or monsters, just a person whose intentions I never found out, and that scared me more than any story ever could. From that day on, I made a rule to trust my instincts, to never camp alone in places I don't know well, and to always keep my phone charged and ready, no matter how remote the place. Nature is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. And sometimes, the scariest thing is not what you imagine. It's what's quietly watching you from the dark. The sky was a deep shade of blue when I finally arrived at the camping spot. It was late afternoon, and the forest around me was already beginning to cool down from the heat of the day. I pulled my car off the narrow dirt road and looked around at the trees, tall pines that swayed slightly in the evening breeze. The smell of pine needles and damp earth filled the air. I felt that familiar mix of excitement and nervousness that always came with camping alone. This time, I had chosen a place deep in the woods, far from the usual crowded sites. I wanted quiet, to be alone with nature and my thoughts. Unloading my gear from the car, I moved slowly but efficiently. My backpack was heavy, packed with essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, a first aid kit, and some extra clothes. The ground here was soft but covered in dry pine needles, perfect for pitching a tent. I found a small clearing that looked flat and sheltered from the wind. Around me, the trees stood close together, creating a dense wall of green. The shadows were already stretching long as the sun dipped lower. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected. My hands were clumsy from the cold that was starting to creep in, and the stakes didn't want to go into the ground easily. I paused a few times, listening to the sounds of the forest. Birds chirped their last songs before nightfall. A distant woodpecker hammered on a tree, steady and rhythmic. I heard a small rustle nearby, maybe a squirrel or some other small animal. The quiet was deep and heavy, broken only by these natural noises. Once the tent was up, I gathered some dry wood for a fire. I knew that once it got dark, the temperature would drop fast. Sitting by a fire would keep me warm and give me some company in the vast loneliness. Finding dry wood wasn't easy. The forest floor was damp in places, and most of the fallen branches were either too wet or too green. I had to search carefully, breaking small twigs and gathering dry leaves to get the fire started. It was around 7 p.m. when the fire finally caught. The flames flickered and popped, sending small sparks into the night air. I sat close, the warmth slowly spreading through my jacket. The forest darkened around me, the trees now tall black shapes against the starry sky. I took out some food, simple stuff, canned beans heated over the fire, a few crackers, and some water. The meal was nothing fancy, but it tasted good. The firelight made everything feel a little less intimidating. After eating, I cleaned up and stuffed everything back into my backpack. I left the fire burning low, surrounded it with stones to keep it contained. I wanted to stay awake a little longer, just to enjoy the calm of the woods at night. As the fire died down to glowing embers, I lay back on my camping mat inside the tent. The sounds of the forest were different now. The birds were silent, replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl. Somewhere nearby, leaves rustled again, and I heard the faint snapping of twigs. I knew animals were moving around, but I couldn't see anything. The darkness was thick, and the only light came from the faint glow of embers outside. Sleep was slow to come. I kept hearing small noises, a branch breaking here, a soft thump there. It was hard not to imagine things in the dark, but I told myself it was just wildlife. The tent fabric moved slightly with the wind, and the smell of smoke mixed with pine kept me grounded. Eventually, I drifted off. I woke suddenly to a strange noise. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. A soft scraping sound, like something moving against the tent. My heart started to beat faster. I froze, listening closely. The noise stopped, then started again, closer this time. I tried to control my breathing, telling myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. But the sound was too deliberate, too steady to be just a random animal. I stayed quiet, waiting. Then I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps crunching on dry leaves just outside the tent. Not one or two steps, but slow, careful walking back and forth. It was enough to make my skin crawl. I wanted to get up and look, but I was frozen with fear. Suddenly, the tent fabric shook, like someone or something pressed against it. I grabbed my flashlight and switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. Outside, there was nothing visible, just the dark shapes of trees. No sign of movement. The footsteps had stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching my flashlight, eyes wide open. The fire was out, and the temperature dropped sharply. The forest around me was silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When the first light of dawn finally came, I stepped outside carefully. The forest was bathed in soft, pale light. The ground near my tent was disturbed, with small footprints that didn't match any animal I knew. They were too big and too human-looking. My heart pounded as I realized someone had been near me during the night. I packed up quickly, glancing nervously around as I moved. The feeling of being watched didn't disappear. I didn't stop until I was back on the dirt road, far from the campsite. Once I reached my car, I locked the doors and took a deep breath, the safe hum of the engine grounding me. Looking back, I realized how vulnerable I had been. The forest was beautiful but could be dangerous in ways I hadn't expected. I promised myself I would be more careful next time. Maybe not camp so deep in the woods alone, and always keep my phone charged and within reach. This trip taught me something important. Nature isn't just quiet and peaceful. Sometimes there are other people out there, and not all of them mean well. Being prepared and alert isn't just about animals or weather. It's about trusting your instincts and respecting your limits. The memory of those footsteps and the night shaking my tent stayed with me for a long time. But I never let it stop me from going outside again. Instead, it made me wiser, more aware. Now, when I camp, I take more precautions. I choose safer spots, tell someone where I'm going, and keep my gear ready for anything. It's the only way to enjoy the wilderness and come back safe. I was 32 when I decided to take a break from everything. Life in San Diego had gotten too loud, too crowded. Every day felt like I was being pulled in 20 directions at once. Work, bills, traffic, noise, people everywhere, always trying to get somewhere faster than they should. I had been working in IT for over 10 years by then, staring at monitors, breathing recycled air, never really doing anything with my hands besides typing or scrolling. It wore me down more than I thought it would. So that spring, I planned a solo camping trip. Nothing fancy, just me and the woods for a few days. I picked a spot up in the northern part of Idaho, near a remote stretch of forest just past the Payette National Forest, somewhere west of McCall. I didn't tell many people, just left a note with my brother saying I'd be out of cell range for a bit and would be back by the end of the week. I didn't want to be disturbed. I needed that silence. I had done some camping before, but nothing this isolated. I packed a sturdy tent, a small propane stove, 2 coolers with enough food and water to last me 4 days, a water purifier, tools, basic first aid supplies, a map, compass, and a GPS that I always kept in my day pack. I even brought a small weather radio just in case. I was cautious like that. I didn't want any surprises. I drove out early on a Tuesday morning, got to the forest edge by mid-afternoon, and parked in a small clearing that looked like it hadn't seen another vehicle in months. From there, I hiked about 5 miles into the woods, following an old logging trail that twisted its way through thick pines and birches. The forest was quiet, too quiet in some ways. No distant highway hum, no overhead planes, just wind through the branches and the occasional flicker of movement from squirrels or birds. That was the peace I'd been craving. I found a small open area just off the trail, surrounded on 3 sides by dense trees and mossy undergrowth. It had enough space for my tent and a makeshift fire pit. There was even a trickling stream about 100 yards downhill where I could refill my water bottle. I set up camp, gathered some dry wood, and got a small fire going. I made some pasta and beans on the stove and sat back against a tree, staring up at the patchy sky through the trees. That first night, I slept hard, deeper than I had in weeks, the kind of sleep that makes your body feel like it's resetting. When I woke up the next morning, everything smelled like wet pine and smoke. It had rained a little overnight, but not enough to bother anything. I boiled some coffee, ate a granola bar, and hiked a bit further up the ridge to get a better view. The forest stretched forever in every direction. No sign of houses, no cabins, not even smoke. Just trees and rocks and more trees. The second night, I stayed up late, sitting by the fire, just listening. There was something about that darkness, the kind that's so complete you can't even see your own hand unless it's right in front of your face, that made me feel more alone than I had expected. Still, it wasn't a bad feeling, just unfamiliar, like I had stepped into a version of the world that wasn't meant for people. But things started to change the next day. It began with something small. I noticed that a few of the items in my campsite had been moved around. Nothing big, just subtle shifts. My metal cup had been moved from the cooler to the edge of the fire pit. A piece of folded tarp that I had stashed under my backpack was now on top of it. At first, I thought maybe I had done it myself and forgotten, but I was sure I hadn't used that tarp since I set it down. It bothered me, but I didn't panic. Animals get curious. Maybe something sniffed around during the night. That afternoon, while I was walking down to the stream, I saw footprints. Not mine. I had been wearing sturdy hiking boots with a very distinct tread pattern. These were different, bigger, wider, and barefoot. That's what really caught me off guard. Who walks barefoot out here? The prints weren't old either. They were fresh enough that the edges were still wet and dark where the soil had been pressed down. I followed them for a bit, maybe 30 or 40 feet, but they led off into the thickest part of the trees and vanished. That's when the unease set in. Not fear exactly, just a pressure in my chest. A feeling like I wasn't as alone as I thought I was. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every little noise outside my tent had me reaching for the small hatchet I kept next to my sleeping bag. I didn't hear any footsteps or branches snapping, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the call of an owl. Still, I lay there for hours wide-eyed, listening to nothing. The following morning, I made the decision to move my camp further uphill, closer to the ridge. I packed up quickly, scanned the area for anything else strange. Nothing, but the old pressure was still there. I hiked maybe a mile and a half up the slope and found another spot. This one was a bit more exposed but had a better view of the surrounding area. I figured it would be harder for someone or something to sneak up on me, but when I unpacked my gear, I realized something was missing. My folding knife. I always kept it in the outside pocket of my backpack. It was gone. Not misplaced, gone. That pocket was zipped shut the whole time I hiked. I checked everything, turned the bag inside out, even emptied my tent. Nothing. I had a backup knife in my cooking kit, but it was small, meant for cutting cord or sausage, not for protection. That was when I started to get angry. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it felt like someone was screwing with me, watching, testing how I would react. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't cook. I didn't want to draw attention to my new location. I ate some jerky and sat in the dark with my back against a rock, facing out toward the slope. The moon was almost full, casting enough light through the trees that I could see the clearing around me. I sat like that for hours, my ears tuned to every sound. Just after midnight, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was an animal, something low to the ground. But then it stood up, person, at the edge of the clearing, maybe 20 feet from the tree line. They didn't move closer, just stood there, watching me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I didn't look away. My heart was hammering in my chest. I reached slowly for the backup knife in my pocket. Not that it would do much, but I didn't want to be completely helpless. The figure just stood there. Minutes passed. Then, just as silently as they had appeared, they backed up into the trees and vanished. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept expecting them to return. Every sound made me twitch. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed up everything as fast as I could, barely bothering to organize it. I just shoved it all into the backpack and headed straight down the slope toward the trail. I didn't eat, didn't drink, just walked, fast. I kept checking behind me every few minutes, but I never saw anyone. But then I reached the old trail and saw something that stopped me cold. A single boot print, large, deep, pressed directly on top of one of my older footprints from the hike in. Someone had followed me, or maybe even gotten ahead of me. The print was clearer than mine, which meant it was fresher. That was when I started to jog. The 5 miles back to the car felt like 50. My legs were burning. My lungs ached, but I didn't stop. I passed by an old log bridge and noticed bark scraped off in places, like someone had slipped or crossed it in a hurry. That same pressure in my chest from earlier had become a full-blown panic. When I finally reached the clearing where I had parked, I nearly cried. The car was still there, but something was wrong. All 4 tires had been slashed. Deep, long cuts across the sidewalls. Useless. There were no houses nearby, no towns within walking distance. I had no cell signal, and whoever had been following me had either done this already or was nearby watching me discover it. I locked myself in the car and kept my head down. I stayed there for hours, barely blinking, just listening. I had a flare in the emergency kit, but it was broad daylight, useless unless someone was flying overhead. Around late afternoon, I made a decision. I left the car behind and started walking along the logging road. I figured if I kept heading west, I would eventually hit a road or a ranger station. I walked until it got too dark to see and then climbed up a tree about 10 feet off the ground. I tied myself to the trunk with my belt and tried to sleep. The night was long, cold. My muscles cramped. I thought I heard footsteps below me once or twice, but I never saw anyone. I stayed in that tree until the sky started to lighten again. Then I climbed down and kept walking. By late afternoon the next day, I found a gravel service road, and then a logging truck passed. I ran out into the middle of the road and waved until the driver saw me. He stopped, clearly confused, and let me climb in. I didn't explain much, just said my tires had been slashed and I'd gotten lost. He dropped me off at a ranger station about an hour away. I filed a report. The rangers were polite but didn't seem too concerned. No signs of anyone living out there, they said. Could have been a drifter, or maybe an old hermit. They'd check it out, they said. I never heard back from them. I never went camping alone again. Not in the I decided to go camping by myself in late October, which isn't the smartest time of year for it, especially in northern Pennsylvania where the nights dip well below freezing and the days feel like they're barely hanging on to autumn. But I wanted to get away. I'd been working nonstop, feeling boxed in by people, noise, and screens. I just needed silence and space, and I figured a weekend alone in the woods would help reset my mind. I picked a state forest I'd never been to before. It was called Loyalsock. A friend had mentioned it once and said it wasn't too crowded, even in peak season. I looked it up, found a few trail maps, and planned a solo loop that would take me about 6 miles in, where I could camp for a night or two, and then loop out another route. No big climbs, just quiet paths through deep forest. I packed light but smart tent, sleeping bag, sleeping pad, headlamp, water filter, layers of warm clothes, a hatchet, a little stove, enough food for 3 days, a metal cup, and a sturdy backpack. I didn't bring any kind of satellite phone or GPS beacon, which I probably should have, but I figured I'd stay on the trails and wouldn't take risks. I drove out on a Friday morning. The last half hour was all back roads, curving through hills and under big branches that looked like they were one strong wind away from snapping. When I got to the trailhead, there was only one other car in the gravel lot. I locked up, made sure I had everything, adjusted the straps on my pack, and started walking. The first few miles were beautiful. Everything smelled like pine needles and damp leaves. The trail was narrow and a little overgrown, like not many people had walked it lately. The trees were still full of color, but there were a lot of bare branches too. It was quiet except for the wind moving through the trees and the occasional distant caw of a crow. The only other tracks I saw on the trail were deer prints and a few signs of raccoons. No people, no trash, no boot prints. I liked that. After about 4 hours of walking, I came to a small clearing where 2 fallen trees made a kind of natural barrier on 3 sides. It was flat and dry, and there was a circle of stones someone had clearly used as a fire ring before. I decided to make that my camp for the night. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping gear, and boiled water for a hot meal. As the sun dipped low behind the trees, the temperature dropped quickly. I bundled up in my jacket and hat and sat by the fire I built, letting the heat soak into my legs while I drank hot tea from my metal cup. It was the kind of silence I came out there for. Just wind, fire, and the distant crack of a branch somewhere off in the woods. I turned in early, just after dark, zipped up the tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag. I slept well, better than I expected to. No animals came sniffing around, no weird sounds, just cold, deep forest silence. The next morning, I had oatmeal and coffee and packed everything up. I planned to hike another 3 miles that day to a spot I'd marked on my map. There was supposed to be an old Forest Service cabin, long abandoned, where people sometimes camped nearby. Not inside, since it was technically off limits, but there was good water and flat ground. I figured it would be a cool place to see. The trail leading there was narrower and harder to follow. A lot of fallen leaves had covered the path, and I had to keep checking the blazes on the trees to make sure I was going the right way. Around mid-afternoon, the forest started to feel different. Not eerie exactly, just still. I hadn't seen any deer or squirrels that day, and the wind had died down. The sun barely made it through the thick trees, and I felt like I was walking through a tunnel of branches. About a mile from the old cabin site, I found a side trail that wasn't on my map. It looked like a game trail at first, narrow, uneven, but there were old boot prints in the mud, almost faded. I paused, stared at the prints, and decided to keep going on the main trail. I didn't need surprises. I just wanted to get to the site, make camp, and relax again. When I got to where the cabin was supposed to be, it was there, but it wasn't what I expected. It was more of a shack, really, leaning to one side, its roof half caved in, wood rotting and blackened with age. Still, it had some character. I walked around it slowly, not wanting to step on any weak boards or nails. It was definitely not safe to go inside, so I picked a flat area about 50 yards away and set up my tent under a big oak. There was a little stream nearby, not deep but clear enough to filter water from. I made dinner and watched the last light fade behind the ridge. That night was different. I had a hard time falling asleep. I kept thinking about the trail with the old boot prints and how still the woods had felt. I tried to brush it off as nerves. I wasn't used to being alone for this long. Maybe my brain just needed something to worry about. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. Not an animal. It wasn't rustling or scampering. It was softer, like something brushing lightly against fabric. I lay still, listening. It came again, a faint shushu sound. I held my breath and waited. Nothing. Then it came again, closer this time. I slowly reached for the hatchet I kept beside my sleeping bag. My hand gripped the handle, my heart pounding. I didn't unzip the bag. I didn't move. I just lay there, listening. Whatever it was, it passed by the tent and moved off toward the stream. I didn't sleep again after that. When dawn finally came, I got up and checked around the tent. No footprints, no signs of animals, nothing out of place, but something had definitely moved past in the night. I packed quickly and didn't eat breakfast. I just wanted to get moving. I decided not to loop out the long way like I'd planned. Instead, I aimed to backtrack and head out the same way I came. It would be quicker, and I didn't feel like exploring anymore. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I walked, listening for that soft brushing sound. I didn't hear it again, but the feeling stayed with me. By early afternoon, the clouds had rolled in and the woods got darker. I felt like I was being watched, not by animals. I've seen enough deer and bears to know what that feels like. This was different. It made the back of my neck itch, and I found myself turning around every few minutes, scanning the trees. At one point, I passed the same fork where that old side trail split off. This time I stopped. I don't know why. I looked at the path again. The boot prints were still faintly there, but I noticed something else now. A broken branch about 5 feet up, snapped clean like something big had come through. That made me uneasy. I didn't remember that branch being broken the first time. I pushed on, trying to keep a steady pace, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The forest was too quiet. Even the wind was gone. It was like the woods were holding their breath. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I saw something on the ground that made me stop cold. It was a plastic grocery bag, half buried under leaves. Fresh, clean, no mold, no fading, like it had been dropped recently. I hadn't seen it on my way in, and I would've. It was bright white against all the brown. I picked it up and saw that it had something inside. A crushed energy drink can and a small empty meat stick wrapper. It wasn't mine. I hadn't brought anything like that. It meant someone else had been out here recently, and I hadn't seen or heard a soul since I arrived. I carried the bag with me, figuring I'd throw it away later, but the sight of it made me more anxious. I started walking faster, my pack bouncing a little, the hatchet in my hand now instead of strapped to the side. Then I smelled smoke. Faint, but unmistakable. Not wood smoke. It smelled like burnt plastic, sharp and toxic. I stopped and sniffed the air again. It was coming from ahead of me, in the direction of the trailhead. I moved slower now, crouching low and stepping carefully. I didn't want whoever it was to hear me coming. I don't know what I expected. A careless camper? A group of kids? But something about the smell was wrong. I crept up to a small rise where the trail curved around a hill. I stepped off the path and climbed up through the trees until I could see down toward the trailhead. What I saw stopped me. There was a car at the trailhead, but not the same one that had been there when I arrived. That one was gone. This was a beat-up blue pickup with rust all along the side. Smoke was drifting up from behind it, and I saw the source. A pile of something burning on the ground. Plastic, wood, maybe paper. Couldn't tell. But it wasn't a campfire. It was just a mess someone had lit on fire. I scanned the area for movement. I couldn't see anyone, but I wasn't going down there. I backed away slowly, then turned and moved off-trail, cutting through the woods parallel to the road that led out. I knew it wasn't smart to bushwhack like that, but I had to get out of there without being seen. It took me over an hour to get back to the road. I came out about half a mile from the lot, near a drainage ditch. I could see the edge of the blue truck through the trees. Still no sign of people, but the fire had burned out and left a black smear on the gravel. I didn't go to my car. I crouched behind the brush and waited. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Just as I started to consider making a run for it, I saw a figure emerge from the trees on the opposite side. I decided to take a break from everything in August 2021, just after I quit my job. I'd been stuck in an office for years and needed time alone, away from people, noise, screens, all of it. I'd always liked being outside, but I hadn't gone on a real solo trip before. I figured I'd keep it simple and head into the hills near Bozeman, Montana. I'd found this old trail that used to be popular with hunters years ago, but apparently no one really used it anymore. The maps showed a few flat spots good for camping and a small creek running nearby. I packed enough for a full week. Tent, food, gear, 2 knives, a hatchet, and a .38 revolver. I kept more for bears than anything else. The first 2 days were fine. I hiked in about 6 miles, set up camp near a bend in the creek, and made myself a little area where I could cook, keep food hung up, and have a decent fire without worrying about it spreading. It was quiet, peaceful. I woke up each morning to the sound of running water and birds, made coffee on the little stove, and just sat for a while watching light creep through the trees. It was what I'd wanted. Complete silence, space to breathe, no pressure to be anywhere or talk to anyone. On the 3rd day, things started to shift, though I didn't really notice at first. I was about 2 miles from camp following a narrow game trail, mostly just walking and enjoying the breeze. It was late morning. I'd been moving slow, just listening and looking around. That's when I noticed the sound of another step behind mine. I stopped. At first I thought it might just be an echo or maybe a deer that got spooked, but when I turned around, I didn't see anything. The woods looked the same as always. I waited a bit, listening. Nothing. I figured maybe I was just being jumpy and kept going. But over the next hour or so, I kept hearing little things. Twigs snapping, faint crunches on the trail behind me. Once I thought I caught a glimpse of something moving quickly off to the side, but it was gone before I could really focus. I stood there for a minute, just staring into the trees. It didn't feel like an animal anymore. The steps were too measured, too much like mine. I walked back to camp slower than usual, glancing over my shoulder more than I wanted to. That night, I kept the fire going longer. I wasn't cold, but something in my stomach told me not to let it go dark just yet. I hung my food like I always did, zipped myself into the tent, and laid there with the gun beside my sleeping bag. Couldn't sleep. Every time I started to drift, I'd hear something outside, small noises, like movement just beyond the tree line. I told myself it was raccoons, maybe a coyote nosing around, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded like someone trying to stay quiet and failing just a little bit. When morning came, I was tired and edgy. I made coffee, barely drank it, and spent a long time just staring at the trees. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there watching my tent. I thought about packing up and heading back early, but I didn't want to let fear drive me out. I told myself I was overthinking it and decided to go for another short hike. About a mile out, I found something that stopped me cold. It was a footprint. Not a boot print, but bare feet and big. It looked fresh. I bent down and stared at it for a while. The heel and toes were clear, and it wasn't mine. I always wore boots, even around camp. I checked the area around it and found a second print, a little farther off the trail. It wasn't a bear or any kind of animal I could name. It was a human foot. Someone had been walking barefoot out here. I turned back right then, walking fast and looking around more than I should have. I kept thinking, who the hell walks barefoot 6 miles into the woods? And why? I got back to camp in the early afternoon and started making some noise, breaking sticks, dragging logs, hammering stuff with a rock. I figured if someone was lurking, maybe they'd think I wasn't worth bothering. I didn't feel like staying anymore, but I told myself I'd sleep one more night and head out early the next morning. That night was worse than the last. I kept the fire going big and bright, used nearly all the wood I had stacked. I sat close to it, watching the trees. My ears were sharp, picking up every small sound. At one point, I thought I heard breathing behind the tent. Slow, steady, close. I didn't move. I just sat, waiting, gun in my lap, eyes on the dark. I stayed like that for hours, barely blinking. Nothing came into the light. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun finally started rising, I packed everything in 15 minutes flat. I didn't eat, didn't drink, just shoved things in my pack and started hiking fast down the trail. I kept checking behind me every few minutes. About 2 miles from camp, I saw something that stopped me again. Hanging from a low tree branch was a small object tied with fishing line. I walked up to it carefully. It was a little bundle of twigs wrapped with some old cloth and fishing hooks. It didn't mean anything to me, but it was clear someone had made it. It was deliberate. I cut it down and tossed it, then picked up my pace. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was soaked in sweat and jumpy at every sound. I got in my car and drove straight to the nearest town, parked outside a diner, and just sat in the car for a while breathing. I didn't go back for the rest of the summer. I didn't talk to anyone about it either. Weeks passed, then months. I tried to forget about it, told myself it was just some hermit or survivalist messing around. I moved on with things. Got a new job, started dating someone, went back to city life. But part of me never really let go of what happened. In March the next year, I read a news story that froze my blood. Some hikers found a campsite deep in the same woods, makeshift, weird. No tent, just branches and tarps. Inside they found bones, small ones, Deer mostly, but some were harder to identify. The place had been abandoned. Nearby, they found strange little totems made of sticks and cloth, like the one I saw. Police said someone had probably been living out there for years. They never caught the person. That confirmed it for me. I hadn't imagined it. Someone was out there close to my camp, watching, maybe even following me for days. I think if I'd stayed one more night, things might have gone different. I kept playing it back in my head. Every step, every sound, every decision. I realized how easy it would have been for someone to sneak up on me, how vulnerable I'd really been out there. After that, I changed how I camp. I don't go alone anymore. I pick popular trails, carry more gear, let people know where I'm going and when I'll be back. I don't care if it's less wild. That trip shook something in me I didn't know could be shaken. People always think the danger in the woods is bears or getting lost or weather turning bad. But sometimes it's other people, the ones you never see, the ones who don't want to be found. I was lucky. I left early. I trusted my gut. And maybe that's what saved me. I had been planning the solo camping trip for months. After spending too many weekends stuck in my small apartment, staring at screens, eating the same takeout, and listening to the same background noise of traffic outside my window, I felt the need to escape somewhere quiet and remote. I wasn't new to camping. I'd done my fair share of hikes and weekend getaways, mostly with friends, but this time I wanted to be alone, just to see if I could do it. Just me, the forest, and a few days with no one to answer to. I picked a location in northern Idaho. There's a patch of dense forest near Lake Pend-O'Reilly that isn't part of a well-known park, but there are old logging roads that cut deep into the area. It was far from anything urban. No rangers, no staff stations, no cell signal. That was the draw for me. I wanted the quiet. The plan was simple. Drive up early Friday morning, find a good flat spot by early afternoon, set up camp, and stay out there until Monday morning. I brought enough water, food, and gear for 4 full days, and I made sure everything was packed the night before. The drive up was long but peaceful. Once I left the highway, the road narrowed into gravel and dirt. I passed a few older trail markers, but nothing that looked recently maintained. That was fine. I was looking to go off-grid anyway. I followed a faded logging road for about an hour, twisting deeper into the woods. The trees got taller, and the sunlight started to thin through the branches. I found a clearing not far from a shallow stream. There were no signs of recent human activity, no fire pits, no trash, not even any obvious trails. That was perfect. The area was flat, wide enough for a small tent, and surrounded by pine trees that would cut down on wind. I parked the SUV about 20 yards from the spot, hauled my gear out, and started setting up. The tent went up first, then I gathered some rocks for a fire ring and cleared away loose brush. I kept things simple. The first night went quietly. I cooked a small meal using my portable stove, listened to the soft breeze moving through the trees, and watched the sky turn orange through the canopy. When it got dark, it got really dark. I'd forgotten how black the forest could get without city light. I sat with my flashlight on for a while, just listening, crickets, the slow trickle of water, the occasional hoot from an owl. I fell asleep fast that night. The second day was just as peaceful. I took a long walk in the morning, following the stream uphill. I found deer tracks, a few small animal burrows, and what looked like an old hunting blind made from branches. It looked abandoned, and I didn't think much of it. When I got back to camp around noon, I spent the afternoon reading, making coffee, and napping in the shade. Late that afternoon, I heard something strange while I was digging a small trench to keep water runoff away from my tent in case it rained. It was faint at first, like a distant clanging metal on metal, but it didn't last long. I stopped what I was doing and listened, but the sound had already stopped. I figured maybe it was something loose in the SUV, or maybe just a bird knocking something over. That night felt different. I didn't feel watched exactly, but I was more alert. I kept my headlamp on longer, and I noticed I was checking behind me more than usual. There were no sounds out of place, but I couldn't shake the tension building in my chest. I wrote it off as being too deep in my own head. Being alone can mess with your sense of comfort. I reminded myself I'd done this sort of thing before. The next morning, things got strange. I woke up and stepped outside the tent to stretch and piss, and that's when I noticed the first change. One of my food containers, a sealed plastic box I kept up on the tailgate, was on the ground. The lid had been removed and was sitting 2 feet away. The food inside was still there, but the container itself had been moved like someone had picked it up, opened it, and set it down. It wasn't chewed or clawed, and there weren't any bite marks or signs of an animal digging through it. I looked around for footprints but didn't find any. The ground in that area was packed and dry. I checked the rest of my gear. Nothing else had been touched. I figured maybe I left the box unlatched the night before and the wind or a raccoon had knocked it over. Still, it didn't sit right. I repacked everything carefully and moved the food into the SUV, locking the doors. That afternoon, I hiked farther upstream than before. I brought my day pack, a knife, water, and my lighter, just in case. About an hour into the walk, I found a spot where the trees opened up into a thin field full of waist-high grass and rocks. There was an old fire pit near the center, blackened stones and ash that looked old, but not ancient. There were also a few logs dragged nearby, like someone had used them as seats. It was quiet, unnaturally quiet. I stayed there for a while, just taking it in, then decided to walk past the field and into another section of dense woods. That's where I found something that made my stomach tighten. There was a rope hanging from a tree. Not a noose, but a thick piece of frayed rope tied to a branch about 10 feet up. The other end was on the ground, partly buried in leaves. It looked old, sun-bleached and worn from the weather, but it didn't look like it had been there for years, maybe a few weeks. I couldn't figure out why it was there. It didn't make sense as part of a camp setup, no tarp or gear nearby, just the rope and some scattered trash on the ground. A rusty can, a broken bottle, a pair of torn gloves. I didn't like the feeling I got there. It wasn't just discomfort, it was pressure, like the air had thickened. I turned back and started the hike to camp. When I got back, everything looked normal at first. Then I noticed the driver's side door of the SUV was open. Not wide, just slightly ajar. I knew for a fact I'd closed it earlier when I moved the food inside. I hadn't unlocked it since. I approached slowly, heart pounding, and checked the vehicle. Nothing inside had been taken or touched, as far as I could tell. The food was still there, the keys still in the cup holder where I'd left them. I closed the door and stood there for a long time. There were no other tracks around the car. No broken branches, no new signs of movement, just that open door. I checked the back and sides, then walked a wide circle around the camp, looking for any sign of another person. Trash, boot prints, bent grass, anything. I didn't find anything. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lantern burning low, and every few minutes I sat up to listen. A few times I thought I heard something in the woods, maybe a crack of a branch, but it was always far off. I stayed in the tent, clutching my knife, staring at the fabric above me, trying not to imagine things. When morning came, I made coffee just to feel normal again. I sat by the stream and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe the door hadn't latched all the way. Maybe I was just spooked by being alone for too long. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but I decided to pack up. I didn't want to wait around for something worse to happen. I moved fast, collapsed the tent, packed the stove, double-checked the SUV. I was about to start the engine when I heard something behind me. It wasn't a branch breaking. It wasn't an animal running. It was a soft scraping sound, like something sliding against bark. I turned, scanning the trees, and that's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a pine tree, was a shape, person, just standing there, motionless. I couldn't see their face. They were wearing dark clothes, something like a hood or a hat, and they weren't moving, just standing in the shadow, staring straight in my direction. I froze. My body wouldn't move for several seconds. The air felt sharp in my lungs. Finally, I stepped back toward the driver's side door and opened it slowly, keeping my eyes on the figure. They didn't move. I got in, closed the door, and started the engine. Still, they didn't move. I backed out of the clearing, tires crunching over gravel and sticks, and turned the vehicle around. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the person was gone. Just trees. I didn't stop driving until I hit pavement. I made it to a gas station about an hour and a half later, pulled into the lot, and just sat there with the engine off, hands shaking. I never called the police. What would I have told them? That someone stood near my campsite and looked at me? There was no proof, nothing missing, no crime committed. But something about that place was wrong. Someone had been out there, watching, maybe the whole time, maybe just that last day. I deleted all my notes about the location and threw out the map with the hand-drawn trail markings. I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. What scares me most is the idea that I wasn't alone that whole weekend. That someone had been out there, just beyond the trees, watching everything I did, without making a sound. That they could have done something if they wanted to, but they didn't. They just let me know, right at the end, that I wasn't as alone as I thought. That was the message, that I'd been watched, and they wanted me to know it before I left. I was 33 when I decided to go camping alone in the summer of 2022. I had been living in Boise for about 8 years at that point, working remotely as a freelance graphic designer. Things had been stressful with client deadlines and a long streak of sleepless nights. I felt mentally worn out and disconnected. I figured being alone in nature would help clear my head, so I started planning a solo trip into northern Idaho, up near the Panhandle National Forests. I picked a spot about 3 hours from Sandpoint, well off the main roads. I wanted remote, no neighbors, no cell service, no noise. I'd found the place on a backcountry forum, where a guy had written about an old fire road that led to a quiet little meadow by a slow-moving creek. He said there were no designated sites, just open forest, and not many people knew about it. That sounded perfect to me. I spent a couple weeks getting ready. I replaced the worn-out rainfly on my tent, patched a hole in my sleeping bag, sharpened my knife, and tested my small propane stove. I bought freeze-dried meals, trail mix, jerky, and packed water purification tablets. I brought a battery pack, but I also carried a paper map and compass just in case. I had all the survival basics: first aid kit, whistle, tarp, duct tape, paracord, headlamp, extra batteries. I even brought my old .38 revolver and a box of rounds. I never expected to use it. I just felt better having it when I was that far out. I left on a Thursday morning around 6. The weather was warm and dry, high 70s in the day and dropping into the 40s at night. I drove my 4Runner up through Sandpoint, then followed a series of forest roads deeper into the wilderness. The last stretch was the fire road from the forum post. It was overgrown and narrow, more of a path than a road. I drove slow to avoid scraping the undercarriage, bouncing over rocks and fallen branches. Eventually, the trees opened up into a wide, grassy clearing surrounded by thick pines. A small creek cut through the middle, maybe 20 feet wide, quiet and shallow. I parked on a patch of dirt near the tree-line and set up camp closer to the creek. I cleared a flat spot, pitched my tent, staked it down, laid out my sleeping bag, then gathered some wood for a fire later. I boiled water for coffee and sat on a log, watching the sunlight flicker through the trees. I could hear birds calling, water trickling, and the occasional rustle of leaves. No engines, no voices, no buzzing phones. Felt good. That first night was calm. I built a small fire, heated up some chili, and watched the sky turn pink and purple before going dark. I listened to the crickets and frogs and stared up at the stars for a long time. I slept okay, though I woke a few times from the cold or the sound of something moving in the woods. Just small stuff, probably rabbits or raccoons. Nothing worth worrying about. The next day, I explored the area. I followed the creek upstream, walking through ferns and soft dirt underfoot. I saw deer tracks, a pile of elk droppings, and what I thought might have been bear scat, but it looked old. I wasn't too worried about bears. I had bear spray and kept my food in a scent-proof bag hung from a tree. In the afternoon, I collected more wood and practiced starting a fire with flint and steel just for fun. I read for a while and took a nap in the shade. Later, I made rice and beans for dinner and went to bed early. I remember hearing some weird sounds that night, sort of like a low grunt or cough in the distance, but they faded quickly and didn't come back. I fell asleep assuming it was just a deer or elk nearby. The third day was when things started to feel strange. It began small. I woke up and stepped out of the tent to find one of my boots a few feet from where I'd left it. Not far, but I knew I hadn't moved it. I figured maybe I bumped it on my way in or out, or maybe a squirrel dragged it. I shook it out in case something crawled inside and thought nothing more of it. But then, while I was walking to the creek to refill my water bottle, I noticed tracks in the dirt, human boot prints. Not mine. The tread was different. They were wider and shallower than mine and looked fresher. They came from the woods, passed near my tent, and headed back into the trees. I stopped and looked around, trying to see if someone was nearby. I didn't hear anything. No movement, no voices, nothing. I told myself maybe they were old and I just hadn't noticed them before. That evening, I felt jumpy. I kept turning around, scanning the trees. I didn't make a fire, just ate a protein bar and sat quietly. The forest, which had felt peaceful the day before, now felt full of eyes. I stayed awake for hours, listening. Around midnight, I thought I heard something moving across the creek. Something heavy, breaking sticks. I sat up with my flashlight and waited, holding my revolver in my lap. After a while, it stopped. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I found more tracks. These ones were closer to my tent and overlapping my own. Someone had been walking around while I slept. The thought made my stomach tighten. I packed up some food, grabbed my map, and decided to hike up the ridge behind the clearing to get a better view. It was steep and I had to stop often to rest. Near the top, I found a broken tree limb that looked cleanly snapped, like someone had stepped on it or used it as a walking stick. From the ridge, I could see my camp, the winding creek, and a few game trails snaking through the forest. But something else caught my eye. On the opposite slope, maybe 300 yards away, I saw a small patch of something blue, like a tarp. I squinted, trying to see better, but the trees made it hard to tell. It didn't look natural. It looked like someone was camped there. I hiked back down fast, adrenaline buzzing. I didn't like the idea of someone else out here who hadn't said hello, hadn't made themselves known. Felt wrong. If they were just another camper, why not wave or say something? I got back to my tent and looked around again. Nothing seemed disturbed, but I still felt watched. That afternoon, I didn't eat. I just sat with my back against a tree, gun in hand, listening. The woods were too quiet. Even the birds seemed to be keeping still. Around dusk, I walked a slow circle around my camp, checking for anything out of place. That's when I found the string. It was thin, nearly invisible fishing line tied between two trees, ankle height, running along the edge of the clearing. I followed it and found it led to a small pile of leaves. Underneath was a crude snare trap, meant for a rabbit or squirrel maybe, but it was placed too close to my camp for comfort. Someone had set it recently. The line wasn't weathered, and the knot was tight and clean. I cut it and tossed it into the creek. I stayed up that night, fire burning low, eyes scanning the trees. At one point, I thought I saw movement near the edge of the forest. Just a shadow, a flicker, but nothing came out. I didn't sleep. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed up fast, not bothering to fold things neatly. I stuffed everything in my pack, doused the fire, and scanned the clearing one last time. That's when I saw the new tracks. Fresh ones, leading from the trees to where I'd been sitting the night before. Someone had come right up to me while I slept, or while I pretended to. I started driving out, but about 15 minutes down the fire road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A tree had been felled across the path. It was small, maybe 8 inches thick, but it blocked the narrow road completely. It hadn't been there when I drove in. The cut looked clean, too fresh, bright wood, no signs of rot. Someone had done it with an axe or a saw, probably in the last day. I stepped out, looking around. The woods were still. I felt like I was being hunted. I climbed back into the 4Runner, locked the doors, and put it in reverse. I drove backwards until I could find a spot wide enough to turn around and started down a different trail I'd marked on the map as a backup exit. It was rough and I scraped bottom once, but it eventually looped back to a gravel road that led toward civilization. When I finally saw a cell tower blinking on a distant ridge, I felt like I could breathe again. I drove straight through to Coeur d'Alene, parked in a motel lot, and just sat there shaking for a while. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't spoken to anyone, but I knew I'd been watched. Someone had been out there with me, sneaking close at night, setting traps, blocking my exit. The next morning, I called the local Forest Service office and gave them the coordinates of the camp. I told them about the traps, the tracks, the tree on the road. The woman on the phone said she'd send someone out to take a look. That was the last I heard of it. I still camp, but I don't go alone anymore. And I don't go anywhere that doesn't have at least one other person nearby. That trip showed me just how vulnerable you really are when you're out in the wild. It's not the animals you have to worry about. It's the people, the quiet ones, the ones who watch without ever saying a word. I had been needing a break from everything for a long time. Work was piling up, my apartment felt like a trap, and I hadn't had a proper night's sleep in weeks. I just wanted to be alone in the woods for a while, to reset my head. I decided to go camping for a few days, somewhere quiet, somewhere no one could bother me. I picked a spot I found online, Burton Lake Reserve, a small area deep in northern Pennsylvania, mostly known for its fishing and hiking. It wasn't a tourist hotspot or anything. That's what made it perfect. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small portable stove, extra clothes, flashlight, a knife, a compass, first aid kit, and a couple of books. I even brought some firewood because I didn't want to waste time gathering it out there. I left early in the morning on a Thursday. The drive took around 4 hours, and the last hour was rough. A narrow, cracked road through the trees, barely wide enough for my truck. It was a bit nerve-wracking, but I liked it. It meant there'd be even fewer people. When I finally arrived, there were only 2 other cars parked at the little gravel lot. One was covered in dust like it had been sitting there for days. The other looked more recent, clean windshield, fresh tire tracks. Still, the place felt empty. I followed the trail for about an hour, then veered off into the woods, looking for a good flat area close to the water but far enough from the trail that I wouldn't run into anyone. After some searching, I found a small clearing between a cluster of spruce trees. The ground was mostly even, dry, and I could hear the lake through the trees about 100 yards away. I set up my tent, laid out my gear, and built a small fire ring with rocks. I sat there for a while just listening. The woods were still, not silent, but soft, birds in the distance, the occasional squirrel darting through underbrush, the wind moving through the leaves high above. It was perfect. That first night I made myself some noodles, read a bit from one of my books, and went to bed early. It was a little cold, but I had layers and a thick sleeping bag. I fell asleep listening to the soft lapping of the water in the distance. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why. My tent was quiet, the forest still. But I had that feeling, you know, the one when your body knows something is off before your mind does. I sat up and listened. Nothing. But then I noticed I didn't hear the lake anymore. The soft sound of water I had fallen asleep to was gone. It didn't make sense. The lake couldn't have just disappeared. I unzipped the flap and stepped outside. It was dark. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the trees. Everything looked normal. Maybe the wind had shifted or something, muffling the sound. I stood there for a few more minutes trying to shake the feeling. Eventually, I went back in and zipped up the tent. I laid awake for a while, heart beating harder than it should have been. I didn't fall back asleep until almost dawn. The next morning I felt off, tired, a little jumpy. I chalked it up to poor sleep and decided to go explore the lake a bit more. I hiked down to the water, sat by the edge, skipped stones, and had a cold breakfast. Around noon, I went back to the tent, read more, then dozed off in the sun for a bit. I kept thinking about how quiet it had gotten the night before. Not just the water, but everything. No birds, no wind, no rustling trees. Just dead silence. It was bugging me more than it should have. Later that afternoon, I went looking for firewood even though I'd brought some. I figured it was good to stay active. I walked maybe half a mile in a wide circle around my site. That's when I saw something odd. A tree not far off with deep cuts in the bark, maybe 3 feet up from the base. Not animal marks, they were too long, too clean, like someone had taken a blade to it. I looked around. No other signs of anything. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. I ran my fingers over the grooves. Sharp edges. Deep, too deep for a pocket knife. I felt a little off again, like I wasn't alone. I scanned the woods around me, standing there still for a few minutes, just looking. Nothing moved. No sounds. I backed away slowly and returned to my camp. That night, I made a fire, cooked some soup, and tried to distract myself. I forced myself to relax, to enjoy the quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept the fire burning longer than I usually would. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I left the flashlight within reach. I lay there staring at the roof of the tent for what felt like hours. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up again. Same time as the night before. Same feeling. I listened. This time I heard something, very faint, a soft crunch of leaves. Then another, not fast, slow, careful. I held my breath. It was close, a few feet outside my tent. My mind raced, heart pounding in my throat. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just listened. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard breathing, not heavy, but close, controlled. I waited. It must have lasted a full minute. Then it backed away slowly. The sound of leaves crunching grew softer, then disappeared. I laid there wide awake, sweating under the sleeping bag. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally came up, I didn't hesitate. I got up, packed my things quickly, stuffing gear back into my pack without organizing. I doused the fire pit, checked the area to make sure I wasn't leaving anything behind, and got out. The trail back to the parking lot felt twice as long. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't stop for water. I just moved. When I got to the lot, only one car was left. Not mine, the other one, the dusty one I'd seen when I arrived. Still there. I glanced inside. A layer of dirt and leaves had built up around the tires. Something was wrong. I took a few steps closer, heart racing again. I looked through the window. There was a jacket thrown over the passenger seat. An old coffee cup in the console. A phone charger dangling. But something was off. The back seat was full of gear. Camping gear, rolled up sleeping bag, a mess kit, empty water jugs. All just sitting there, like it had been untouched for weeks. I backed away. I didn't want to touch the car. I didn't want to know who it belonged to. I just got into my truck and drove. Back home. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept replaying those footsteps outside the tent. That breathing. I knew someone had been out there, watching me. I started doing some digging online, trying to find any reports about Burton Lake. There wasn't much. A few hiking blogs, fishing forums. But then I came across an old local news article, buried in a sheriff's department archive. From 6 years ago, a man in his early 40s had gone missing near Burton Lake. An experienced camper, never found. His car was located at the same lot. The article had a photo. Same car, same make, same model, same color. I stared at that photo for a long time. I called the local authorities and gave them the information, told them what I'd seen. They thanked me, said they'd look into it. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I never followed up. I didn't want to get involved any further. I just wanted to forget the whole thing. But I couldn't. Not really. I still go camping sometimes, but only to state parks, crowded places with families and rangers and cell service. I don't go deep into the woods anymore. I don't camp alone, and I haven't slept in a tent since. Whatever was out there that night didn't make a sound when it came close. It waited, watched, could have done anything, but it didn't. And that's what scares me the most. Not what happened, but what didn't, because I still don't know if it planned to come back the next night, or if it was just waiting for me to fall asleep. I took a week off in late October to finally go on a solo camping trip I'd been putting off for a few years. I'd done plenty of hiking and backpacking before, but always with other people. This time, I wanted the quiet. I wanted to get away from everything, no noise, no emails, no schedule. I picked a remote national forest in eastern Washington. It wasn't a national park, so it didn't get much foot traffic. It was just endless forest, small lakes, a few unpaved roads, and trails that were barely marked. It looked perfect on the maps. Open areas for setting up camp, water sources, and enough distance from the nearest town that I wouldn't run into too many people. I packed light but smart. Tent, sleeping bag rated for cold, camp stove, extra fuel, water filter, food for 8 days, compass, GPS, laminated topo map, bear spray, and an old revolver I only ever brought as a last resort. I wasn't expecting any trouble, but the deeper you go into places like that, the less likely someone will find you fast if something goes wrong. I left a note with my brother, told him the general area I'd be in and the day I planned to be back. I even gave him the GPS coordinates for the trailhead where I'd leave my car. I started the hike on a Monday. The air was sharp and clean. Leaves were already starting to fall, which gave the woods that dead quiet I always loved. It was the kind of silence where you could hear the wind slipping through trees like someone dragging a sheet. My pack was heavy at first, but I got used to it. The trail was rough in spots, but manageable. I didn't see another soul all day. By late afternoon, I'd covered about 9 miles and found a good spot next to a small creek. The ground was flat, dry, and tucked behind a thin tree line. I set up camp, boiled water, ate a hot meal, and settled in early. My body was tired in that good way, the kind of tired that makes you fall asleep fast. The first 2 nights were peaceful. I hiked farther each day, always setting up camp away from the trail, just in case someone passed through. But no one did. I'd see the occasional deer, hear owls at night, but nothing out of the ordinary. The 3rd night, things started to feel a little strange. I'd set up my tent near a ridge, with a steep slope behind me and a small stream 100 yards away. It was quiet that night, quieter than usual. The wind had died completely. No bugs, no rustling. I remember sitting there with my small lantern on, writing in a little notebook, and realizing I hadn't heard anything for a solid 10 minutes. Just the sound of the pen dragging across the paper. I shrugged it off and went to sleep, but woke up sometime later. I didn't know what time it was. The fire had died down, but there was still some orange glow in the embers. I laid there staring at the tent ceiling, heart pounding for no reason. I couldn't figure out what had woken me. I sat up, unzipped the flap just enough to peek out. Nothing. I put on my boots, grabbed the flashlight, and scanned the woods. The beam caught nothing but trees and fog. I waited a bit, then went back inside and laid down. Took a while to fall asleep again. The next morning, there were boot prints about 20 feet from my tent. They weren't mine. I always walked with hiking boots that had deep, wide treads. These were narrow, almost flat, and came from the opposite direction I'd come in from. They stopped near the fire pit and turned back into the woods. I stared at them for a while, trying to make sense of it. They weren't fresh, maybe made sometime during the night or early morning before the dew lifted. I tried not to overthink it. Maybe a hunter or another backpacker came through early. Still bothered me. I didn't hear anyone. The woods carry sound well, especially when it's cold. I packed up fast that morning and moved deeper into the forest. I took a barely marked trail that dropped into a shallow valley with dense brush and rocky ground. I figured if someone was out there messing with people, they'd stick to more obvious trails. I pushed farther than I'd planned, going nearly 12 miles before setting up again near an old stone outcrop. There was a ledge above where I pitched my tent, and I could see a long stretch of woods from there. It made me feel a little more secure, like I could spot someone approaching. That night, I stayed up late, listening, watching, barely blinking. Around midnight, I heard movement. Dry leaves crunching underfoot, slow and deliberate. It wasn't an animal. Animals move differently, faster, and without hesitation. This was steady. I turned off the lantern, slipped out of the tent, and crouched behind a boulder. The sound was faint, maybe 70 or 80 feet away. I couldn't see anything at first, then caught a shadow moving between trees. No flashlight, no headlamp, just a dark figure walking slowly. I stayed completely still. They moved past without noticing me, heading toward where I'd set up my tent. I waited there for what felt like an hour, heart hammering, body freezing. Eventually, the sound faded. I crawled back into the tent, grabbed my revolver, and sat up the rest of the night with my back against the wall. In the morning, I found more boot prints near the tent. Same tread, same direction. This time, they stopped about 6 feet from where I'd been sleeping. I couldn't take it anymore. Something was off, and I didn't want to find out what. I packed everything in 20 minutes and started heading back toward the trailhead. It was a long haul, more than 20 miles if I went the direct route, but I figured I could do it in a day if I kept moving. I only stopped to filter water or eat a snack. By the time the sun started to dip, I was about 8 miles from the car. That's when I noticed someone had been following me. I wasn't sure for how long. I kept hearing what sounded like twigs snapping just out of view. I stopped walking a few times and listened. Each time I stopped, the sound stopped too. I doubled back once, stepped off the trail, and waited behind a thick pine. After a few minutes, I saw movement. Someone creeping through the brush, maybe 100 feet behind. They were trying to stay hidden, but I could see the outline of their shape. No backpack, no gear, just a dark hoodie and jeans. They looked up once, scanning the trail, then kept going. I waited until they passed, then quietly moved in the opposite direction through the woods. I cut across a ridge and moved fast, trying to circle around and come out ahead of them. I didn't want to confront them, I just wanted out. I followed a dry creek bed for nearly a mile before reconnecting with the trail. By now, the light was almost gone, and I didn't want to stop and pull out my headlamp. The next part is something I'll never forget. I was less than 5 miles from the car when I saw a structure tucked off the trail about 50 yards in. It was old and small, like a hunting shack or ranger outpost, half collapsed and covered in moss. I don't know why I went toward it. Curiosity, maybe, but I walked around the side trying to stay quiet. I saw movement through a cracked window. Just a glimpse. I dropped to my stomach behind a fallen log and waited. A few minutes later, someone stepped out. Same figure from earlier. Hooded, slow, head swiveling like they were scanning the trees. I stayed frozen. They walked a circle around the shack, then went back inside. I turned and ran. I didn't care about staying quiet anymore. I just wanted out. I ran until my lungs burned, then kept going. I tripped more than once, branches slapping me across the face and arms. My legs were shaking by the time I saw the glint of my car through the trees. It was still there, untouched. I threw my pack in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I didn't stop until I hit the nearest gas station, an hour down the road. I went inside, used the bathroom, and just sat there on the toilet for 15 minutes trying to breathe. I didn't report it. I probably should have, but what would I even say? A guy followed me in the woods? There wasn't enough to tell anyone. No crime, no face, just prints, a shadow, and the kind of feeling that sticks with you long after it's over. For weeks after, I kept thinking about it. I looked at maps, satellite images, even old logging records, trying to figure out who might have been out there or what that shack was used for. I found a reference to an old trapper's cabin from the 1940s in the same area, long abandoned, supposedly destroyed by a wildfire in the 60s. Maybe that was the place. I'll never know for sure. I still go camping now and then, but never alone anymore, and never that deep. I stick to marked sites, places with cell service, and other people nearby. I bring a satellite beacon, 2 phones, and tell more than one person where I'm going. That trip changed something in me, not just the fear, but the way I see the woods now. Before, they were quiet and peaceful. Now, they feel like they're holding secrets, like there's always someone else out there, just far enough away that you can't see them, only feel them watching. And if I'm being honest, that part of the forest still shows up in my dreams. The tent, the boot prints, the crunch of leaves in the night. Not nightmares exactly, but reminders. Reminders of how easy it is to vanish out there. How close danger can be, even in a place that feels empty. I got out. I was lucky. I know that now, and that's why I've never gone back. I left home around noon on a Friday in early October. The weather had started to cool down, which was exactly what I wanted. I had been planning a solo camping trip for a while, something away from people, noise, and responsibilities. I needed the quiet. I needed to be alone. I chose a place in northern Utah, not too far from Logan Canyon, but off one of the smaller, lesser-known forest roads. I didn't want an official campground with fire rings and marked trails. I wanted something more remote. I found a spot using satellite images online and marked the coordinates. No campsites, no trails, just a clearing surrounded by thick forest. I packed my gear over the course of a few days. I had everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for 4 days, a hatchet, flashlight, backup batteries, a solar charger, water filter, extra layers, and even a compact first aid kit. I had done solo trips before, but never this far from people. I figured it would do me good. I loaded up my old Ford and made the 3.5-hour drive out. By the time I got onto the dirt road that led into the forest, the sun had started dipping. It was about 5 in the evening when I finally reached the general area. The forest was dense and full of narrow trees, mostly lodgepole pines and some spruce. The dirt road wasn't maintained past a certain point, so I parked my truck in a small natural turnout and hiked in the rest of the way, maybe 20 minutes. My GPS kept me on course until I reached the clearing I had seen on the satellite view. It was just how I imagined it. A flat, grassy patch surrounded on all sides by thick trees. Quiet, secluded, perfect. I set up camp quickly. The tent went up without issue. I had a little camp stove, so I heated up a freeze-dried meal, ate while sitting on a log, and watched the light disappear through the trees. It was calm. There was no wind, not even much birdsong, just the kind of silence I was hoping for. After cleaning up, I walked a short loop around the camp to familiarize myself with the area. Nothing unusual. No signs of other campers. The ground was dry, and the forest felt untouched. That first night, I slept surprisingly well. I thought I'd be uneasy since it was so quiet and I was completely alone, but I slept almost through the night. I only woke up once around 3 a.m. to pee. The air was cold and my breath turned into little clouds, but I didn't hear anything out of the ordinary. I went back to sleep quickly and woke up at first light. I started the morning with some instant coffee and a granola bar. My plan was to hike out a few miles with my day pack and explore a bit. I left some of my food strung up in a bear bag just in case. I didn't think I'd need to worry too much about bears in that part of Utah, but I didn't want to take chances. I hiked most of the day, following a creek I had found on my topographic map. It was cold and clear, and I filled up my bottle using the filter. I saw some deer, a hawk, a ton of squirrels, and what looked like elk scat. No people, no boot prints, no signs of fire or litter. By late afternoon, I turned back. I made it back to camp before sundown. The air had that clean, crisp smell of dry leaves and pine. I cooked again, this time a rice and bean pouch, and sat with my back to a tree just listening. That quiet started to feel different, though, like it was too quiet. I remember thinking how weird it was not to hear anything rustling. No wind, no birds, nothing. It didn't sit right, but I chalked it up to being alone for too long and having nothing to distract my brain. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. Every small sound caught my attention. I thought I heard movement outside the tent around midnight, but it stopped almost as soon as I noticed. It wasn't heavy, like a bear. It was lighter, quicker, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, I sat up in my sleeping bag and listened hard. Nothing else followed. I eventually drifted off, but never fully fell into deep sleep. When I woke up that next morning, things started to feel off. Not dangerous exactly, but off. I noticed small things. Some of the sticks and twigs I had broken up near the fire pit looked disturbed. I didn't remember stepping on them again the night before. My food bag was untouched, but the cord had been moved slightly. I told myself it was wind or an animal brushing it. I brushed off the unease and tried to focus on the quiet. That day, I stayed closer to camp and just did small circles of hiking, looking for animal tracks or interesting views. I found a big patch of mossy rocks near a dry creek and sat there for an hour. Again, no people, no human noise. When I returned to camp that afternoon, the first thing I noticed was my folding chair was tipped over. I hadn't left it like that. I was sure. I remember brushing dirt off it after breakfast and leaving it upright facing the fire ring. I picked it up slowly, eyes scanning the clearing. No prints, no damage. I checked my tent zipper. Still closed. I opened it. Nothing inside looked moved. My bag was still zipped. I pulled out the flashlight and checked everything. I even pulled out the first aid kit to see if anything was missing. Everything was in place. Still, something didn't sit right. That night, I couldn't sleep. I laid in the tent, listening. I kept hearing faint crunches. Not often, just every now and then. I stared at the ceiling of the tent for hours, counting seconds between noises. Some sounded close, some farther off. It wasn't wind. There was no wind. It wasn't an animal rooting around. The noises were spaced out too perfectly, too intentionally. At one point, I clicked on my flashlight and scanned through the mesh. Nothing. I sat up, heart pounding, just waiting. But the sounds stopped. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach sink. Near the edge of the clearing, just past where the trees started to thicken again, I found a boot print. Not mine. It was fresher. The tread was different, pointed toward my camp and then turned back toward the trees. I stood over it for a long time. It wasn't large, maybe a size 10, but the ground was soft enough to show the whole pattern clearly. It was too fresh to have been there more than a day. I packed up my cooking gear and didn't bother with breakfast. My hands were shaking. I kept looking around me like someone would step out from behind a tree at any second. I kept telling myself it could be a hunter or another hiker, but I hadn't heard a gunshot or voices or anything since I got there. Whoever it was had come close to my camp and hadn't said anything. That was what bothered me the most. I decided to hike out to the truck and leave a day early. I kept glancing back every few steps. I didn't want to run and panic, but I moved faster than I normally would with a pack. The woods suddenly felt different, like they were pressing in on me. Every sound seemed sharper. I was sure I was being watched. Not in the abstract way people say when they feel paranoid. I mean, I felt it like someone was behind a tree 20 feet away, just standing there. When I got back to the truck, nothing looked touched. I got in and locked the doors right away. I sat there for a few minutes just breathing hard. Then I turned the key. Nothing happened. I turned it again. Still nothing. No clicking. No cranking. Just dead. The battery was fine when I parked. I hadn't left the lights on. I hadn't used the radio. My stomach dropped. I popped the hood, got out, and checked the battery. The terminals were there, but the clamps had been loosened, almost all the way off. I didn't do that. No way I did that. I would have noticed. Someone had been at my truck. I put the clamps back on tight and tried again. The truck started immediately. I threw it in reverse and backed out onto the dirt road without even shutting the hood all the way. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I drove faster than I should have over those uneven roads, tires slipping in some of the looser gravel patches. I didn't stop until I was at the highway. Only then did I pull over and shut the hood properly. I didn't call the police. I didn't report it. I wasn't sure what to say. No one stole anything. No one hurt me. I didn't see anyone. But someone was out there. Someone walked into my camp at night. Someone crept close enough to leave a print. Someone messed with my truck, probably hoping I wouldn't notice until it was too late to fix it. I don't know what they were planning to do if I stayed another night. I don't know if they were watching me from the trees while I sat by the fire or if they were going to come into my tent when I was asleep. I don't know what would have happened if the truck hadn't started. But I do know I'm never going camping alone again. Even now, months later, I still think about that trip. I'll be in the shower or making breakfast or walking through a parking lot and my mind will just jump to that sound. Those slow, soft crunches outside the tent. The print in the dirt. The truck not starting. Sometimes I wake up at night and feel like I'm back there, listening, holding my breath, waiting for something to move outside my door. It wasn't a ghost or some monster. It was just a person. And honestly, that's worse. The forest was quiet when I arrived at the cabin that late October afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the dirt road I had driven down for nearly an hour. The trees around me were tall and dense, mostly pine and fir, with a few old maples stubbornly holding on to their fading orange and red leaves. The air smelled crisp and cool, tinged with the scent of damp earth and fallen needles. I parked my car at the edge of a small clearing where the cabin stood, a modest wooden structure with weathered siding and a steep roof covered in dark shingles. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, a thin ribbon against the dusky sky. I had been looking forward to this weekend alone in the woods for months. The city had worn me down, with its noise and rush and endless crowds. I wanted peace, a chance to breathe, to think, to be quiet. The cabin had belonged to my grandfather, though I barely knew him. After he passed, the place sat unused for years, until I decided to fix it up and spend some time here, away from everything. As I stepped out of the car, the cold bit into my skin through the thin jacket I wore. I grabbed my bag and locked the car before heading toward the cabin's porch. The wood creaked under my boots, worn smooth by years of footsteps. The front door was heavy but opened without much resistance. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, pine resin, and something faintly musty. Dust motes floated in the fading light through the windows, and the interior was shadowy and quiet. The main room had a stone fireplace with a stack of firewood beside it, a small wooden table with 2 chairs, and a threadbare rug on the floor. There was a narrow kitchen along one wall with an old stove and a sink, and a shelf with some basic dishes and cans. A narrow staircase led up to a loft with a bed and a small window that looked out over the trees. The furniture was simple and sturdy but had clearly seen better days. I set my bag down and went to the fireplace. The cold was starting to get to me, and I needed to get a fire going. I stacked some wood, used a couple of old newspapers to get a spark, and after a few tries, flames flickered and slowly grew, sending warmth and a soft glow into the room. The crackling fire felt like a friend, chasing away the chill and the creeping feeling of loneliness that settled in my chest. I spent the next hour unpacking. I had brought some food, warm clothes, a flashlight, a book, and my old camera. The internet was spotty at best here, and I didn't want distractions. I wanted to feel the woods, to hear the wind and the animals, to sleep with the silence around me. As darkness fell, the cabin's windows showed nothing but black. The stars were starting to come out, faint pinpricks of light above the trees. I sat near the fire, the light casting dancing shadows on the walls, reading my book. The quiet was thick, heavy in a way that made my ears strain to catch even the smallest sounds. Outside, I could hear twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and the occasional distant call of a bird or an animal moving through the underbrush. The wind picked up, making the trees sway and creak. The sound was eerie but natural, like the forest itself was breathing around me. I felt a sudden shiver but wasn't sure if it was from cold or just the unfamiliarity of being alone in this place. Later, I stood outside on the porch for a moment, wrapped in my jacket. The moon had risen and cast a pale light over the clearing. The shadows of the trees stretched long and strange, and the forest looked like a dark ocean of shapes. I could see a few small animals moving at the edges, rabbits or maybe raccoons. A fox darted through the brush, its eyes briefly catching the moonlight before disappearing. That night, I slept in the loft, wrapped in a heavy blanket. The wood creaked with the wind, and at times I heard a thump or scratch outside, probably a branch or a small animal. I kept the fire going low, its warm glow a comfort in the dark. The next morning, I woke to the sun streaming through the window, lighting up dust in the air. I brewed some coffee on the stove and ate cold bread with peanut butter. The forest outside looked different in the daylight, less threatening, more alive and full of color. I decided to explore a bit. I packed a small day pack with water, some snacks, and my camera, then locked the cabin door behind me. The ground was soft underfoot, covered with pine needles and dry leaves. The forest was thick, with trees so close I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. I followed a narrow trail, marked only by faint signs, broken branches, flattened grass, and old footprints I assumed were mine from before. As I walked, I noticed how the forest floor was covered with mushrooms, moss, and tiny plants pushing up through the dead leaves. Birds flitted overhead, and I caught glimpses of squirrels darting between trunks. The smell of pine and earth was strong, grounding me. After about an hour, I came to a small stream, its water clear and cold as it gurgled over smooth stones. I sat on a rock beside it, dipping my fingers in the water, watching leaves float downstream. The sound of the water was soothing, and I felt some of the tension in my shoulders ease. I didn't stray far from the cabin because I wanted to be safe, but the forest had a way of making me feel small and a little lost. I took some pictures of the stream and the trees, trying to capture the stillness. When I returned to the cabin, I found the door slightly ajar. My heart jumped for a moment before I realized it was probably the wind that had pushed it open. I closed and locked it again, feeling a prick of unease. Maybe it was foolish to come here alone, but I didn't want to let fear ruin the trip. That evening, I made dinner on the stove, canned soup and bread, and sat by the fire again. The quiet pressed in on me, and I realized how cut off I was from the world. The phone had no signal, and I hadn't even turned it on. It felt like being on another planet. Just before I went to sleep, I heard something outside, something heavy moving through the underbrush. My first thought was a deer or maybe a bear. I'd read that bears sometimes come near cabins like this looking for food. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and I told myself it was nothing to worry about. Still, I closed the windows and made sure the firewood was stacked safely. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise made me jump. The wind rattling the windows, branches tapping the roof, the distant howl of a coyote. I lay awake for hours, the flashlight on the nightstand my only company. The darkness felt alive, like it was watching me. On the third day, I decided to clean up around the cabin a bit. The place needed it badly. I swept the floor, cleared cobwebs from the corners, and stacked firewood neatly. While working outside, I found old cans and broken tools buried under leaves near the back porch. I cleared them away and tossed them in a trash bag. As I worked, I felt more connected to the place, like I was making it a home again, even if just for a short time. The forest seemed less threatening now, more familiar. Later that afternoon, I walked down a faint trail I hadn't noticed before. It led deeper into the woods, and after a few minutes, I came across an old, rusted metal gate lying flat on the ground, half covered with moss and leaves. Beyond it was an overgrown path that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Curious, I followed the path slowly. The forest grew thicker, darker, and the air cooler. The sounds of animals faded away until all I could hear was the crunch of leaves under my boots. The trees closed in overhead, blocking out most of the sky. After about 20 minutes, the path ended at a clearing. In the center was a small, weather-beaten shed. Its paint was peeling, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. I approached cautiously, my heart beating faster. Something about this place felt off, forgotten and abandoned in a way that made me uneasy. I looked inside the shed through a broken window. The interior was cluttered with old boxes, tools, and what looked like a rotting tarp. There was an odd smell, musty and sour, that made me wrinkle my nose. I decided not to go in. Something about the place felt wrong, and I didn't want to push it. As I turned to leave, I heard a sudden crack behind me. I froze, every muscle tense. It was just a branch snapping underfoot. But in that moment, I felt like I wasn't alone. The feeling stayed with me all the way back to the cabin. That night, I made sure every door and window was locked tight. I piled wood on the fire, making it burn bright and warm. I sat close to it, watching the flames, trying to calm the knot in my stomach. The forest was alive with sound. The wind in the trees, the distant calls of animals, and something else. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the dark, but saw nothing. The beam caught the outline of branches and leaves, but no movement. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was the wind playing tricks, but I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I woke early and stepped outside. The sun was just rising, and the forest was bathed in soft gold. The air was cool but fresh. I wanted to leave, but I also It started as a plan to escape the noise of the city. I needed a break, a few days somewhere quiet and simple. The cabin was in the mountains, far enough from towns and roads to be a real getaway. I had driven hours on a twisting road that climbed higher and higher through pine forests until I finally reached the small clearing where the cabin sat. It looked old but sturdy, made of rough logs stained dark by years of weather. The roof was covered in thick moss and pine needles. A small chimney stuck out of one side, but no smoke came from it. The windows were dusty and fogged from the cold outside. The whole area around the cabin was silent except for the occasional bird call or the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The trees were tall and close together, blocking most of the sky. The sun was low in the late afternoon, casting long shadows that made the forest look even darker. The air smelled clean but sharp, filled with pine and damp earth. I unloaded my gear slowly, making sure to double-check everything. I brought food for a few days, a small gas stove, a flashlight with extra batteries, a first aid kit, and plenty of warm clothes. The cabin had no electricity, and I knew from the photos online that the water was from a nearby stream. I planned to stay 3 nights, alone. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. The floor was wooden planks, creaky and uneven. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, with some dry firewood stacked beside it. There was a table with 2 chairs, a small shelf with old books and some dusty dishes, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. The mattress was thin but looked clean. The windows had no curtains, just wooden shutters that I closed after dark. I set up my stove on the table and heated some water for tea. The cabin felt safe in a rough way. It wasn't fancy, but it was shelter from the cold and the dark forest outside. The quiet settled around me like a heavy blanket. That first night, I went to bed early, tired from the long drive and the work of unpacking. The mattress creaked under me, and the wooden walls seemed to hold the sounds of the forest close. Outside, the wind picked up and the trees creaked and groaned. The sound was eerie, but not frightening. It was just nature being nature. I slept fitfully. Every time I drifted off, some noise would wake me. A branch scraping against the window, the distant call of an owl, the soft crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. At one point, I thought I heard something more deliberate, like a person walking slowly just outside the cabin. But when I turned on the flashlight and looked out the window, there was nothing but dark shapes moving with the trees. The next morning, I found that the storm from the night before had knocked some branches onto the roof. The moss was wetter than before, and the dirt floor outside the door was muddy. I made a fire in the fireplace to dry my clothes and warm the cabin. The dry wood caught quickly, and soon the cabin smelled of smoke and pine. I sat near the fire, sipping my tea and watching the flickering flames. I decided to explore the area a bit. I packed a small backpack with some water, snacks, and my flashlight, then stepped outside. The forest was thick and the ground was uneven with roots and fallen leaves. The trees rose high, their branches forming a canopy that made the forest floor dim even in daylight. I walked carefully, trying not to disturb anything. The air was cool, and the smell of wet earth filled my nose. As I went deeper, I found a small stream bubbling over rocks. The water was clear and cold. I filled my bottle and rested on a fallen log for a while, listening to the sound of the water and the forest. On my way back, I noticed something odd. A set of footprints in the mud near the stream. They were fresh, maybe a day old, and not from any animal I knew. They looked like human footprints, boot prints with deep treads. I followed them back toward the cabin, but they disappeared before I reached the clearing. That night, the feeling of being watched crept in. I kept glancing out the windows, seeing only the waving shadows of the trees. The wind was stronger now, rattling the shutters and making the cabin creak. I made a bigger fire and sat close to it, feeling a little more secure in the warmth. Sleep came again, but it was restless. Around midnight, I woke suddenly to a noise outside, sharp and close. It sounded like something heavy dragging across the ground. My heart jumped. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. I waited for a long time, but nothing else happened. The next day, I stayed mostly inside. The weather was colder and cloudier, and I didn't want to risk getting lost. I checked my supplies carefully and found I still had enough food and water for the remaining time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Late that afternoon, I stepped outside to gather firewood. The forest looked different in the dim light. The shadows were longer and the colors dull. I noticed more footprints around the cabin, some fresh, some older, but no clear direction or pattern. It was as if someone had been wandering nearby, sometimes close, sometimes far. I hurried back inside, locking the door and closing the shutters. The thought that someone might be out there, watching, unsettled me more than the dark or the cold. I tried to keep busy, cleaning the cabin and preparing dinner, but my hands shook a little. As night fell, the wind grew fiercer. The trees bent and snapped, and the roof groaned. I lit the fireplace and sat close to the flames, listening to the storm rage outside. Every crack and pop of the wood made me jump. I kept the flashlight close and the door locked tight. Around midnight, a loud noise woke me again. This time it was banging on the door, heavy and deliberate. My heart hammered. I sat frozen, holding the flashlight ready. The banging stopped after a few moments. I waited and waited, but nothing else came. When dawn finally broke, I opened the door cautiously. The ground was muddy and scattered with broken branches. Near the door lay an old, rusted metal box, half buried in dirt. I had never seen it before. It looked like it had been dropped or left there. I opened the box slowly. Inside were some old photographs and papers, faded and torn. The pictures showed the cabin from many years ago, and people I didn't recognize standing near it. The papers were notes and maps, some with strange marks on them. It seemed like someone had been here before me, hiding things or leaving messages. That day, I realized I wasn't alone in this forest. Someone else had been watching or living nearby, maybe for years. The footprints, the noises, the box, all signs that the cabin had a history I didn't know. I decided to leave early, packing my things quickly. The feeling of being watched was too strong now, and the thought of spending another night there made my stomach twist. On my way out, I took one last look at the cabin, stood quiet and still, almost waiting. The forest around it seemed darker, heavier. I promised myself never to come back. The drive down the mountain was slow. I kept checking my mirrors, feeling eyes on me even on the empty road. When I reached the main highway, relief washed over me. The noise of cars and people felt like safety. Back in the city, I tried to tell myself the whole thing was just my imagination. Maybe the footprints were from hikers or hunters. Maybe the noises were animals or the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something real and strange had been there. The box I found stayed with me. I kept the photos and papers, looking at them sometimes, trying to understand who had left them and why. The cabin had stories to tell, but I would never be part of them again. The sun was just starting to dip below the thick line of trees when I pulled my old pickup truck off the narrow gravel road. The engine choked a little on the cold air, then died as I cut the ignition. I sat for a moment, listening to the forest. The wind moved the dry leaves, and somewhere a bird called out, its cry distant and lonely. I was alone here, miles from the nearest town, deep in the woods where cell signals didn't reach and the roads had long been forgotten. The cabin was small and rough. Weathered wood, stained dark by years of rain and snow, made it blend almost perfectly with the forest behind it. It was my grandfather's cabin, left to me after he passed last year. I'd never spent more than a night or two here before, always with company or in the summer, but now it was winter and I was here alone. I needed the silence, the distance. The city had been too loud, too full of strangers and worries. The first thing I did was unload the truck. I had packed enough food for a week, some firewood, a small stove, blankets, and a few books. The cabin had no electricity or running water, just an old well outside and a wood-burning stove inside. The windows were thick with dust and spider webs. The floor creaked with every step, and the air smelled like damp wood and old smoke. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The floor was cold, the walls uneven. A small kitchen area sat in one corner with a rusty sink, a couple of cupboards, and a battered countertop. On the other side was the living space with a threadbare couch and a wooden table. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, but it was cracked and useless. The stove sat by the back wall, cold and empty. I set down my bags and lit a fire in the stove, the flames flickering to life and warming the room. Outside, the forest was already swallowing the last bits of daylight. The shadows grew longer, darker. I checked the windows. The glass was thin, and I could see the dark shapes of the trees pressing close. A chill ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off. It was just cold and quiet. I cooked some canned beans over the stove and ate slowly, listening to the crackling fire. The silence stretched thick around me, almost heavy. I hadn't realized how loud the city was until this moment, when the only sounds were my own breathing, the fire's hiss, and the occasional creak of the old cabin settling. After eating, I cleaned the dishes and stacked them on the counter. I pulled out a blanket and wrapped it around my shoulders, then settled on the couch. The windows showed the night outside, pitch black but for the faint light of a distant moon. The woods looked endless, like a wall of dark shapes. I tried reading, but the words blurred. My mind wandered to the stories I'd heard about this place, about the loneliness, the cold, and the things that could happen when no one else was around. Not ghosts or monsters, but real dangers. Falling through thin ice, wild animals, or just losing your mind in the silence. The first night passed without much incident. I woke a few times, hearing the wind whistle through the cracks, the branches tapping on the windows like fingers. My thoughts raced, but I calmed myself with the steady sound of the fire. The next day, I woke early. The frost was thick on the ground, sparkling in the pale morning light. I went outside to check the well. The metal cover was cold and slightly frozen to the ground. I managed to lift it and look down into the dark water. It was still and deep. I filled a bucket and hauled it back inside. The cold air bit at my cheeks as I stacked more wood on the stove and lit the fire again. I made some coffee over the flames, the bitter smell filling the cabin. I sat by the window, watching the snow fall softly between the trees, the forest muffled and quiet. Hours passed. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I grabbed my jacket, a flashlight, and my old hunting knife, then stepped out into the woods. The snow crunched under my boots, the air sharp and fresh. I walked slowly, noting the broken branches and footprints frozen in the snow. Some tracks looked like animals, deer or rabbits, but others were harder to place. A pair of boots, maybe human-sized. I stopped, scanning the forest. No signs of people for miles. I tried to tell myself I was just seeing things, that it was probably my imagination. I followed the tracks a little, but they disappeared quickly among the trees. I turned back before it got dark. That night, I kept the fire burning long, stacking logs carefully. I checked the locks on the door and windows. Something about being alone made me more alert, more aware of every noise. The wind seemed louder, carrying strange sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. I lay awake longer than usual. I tried to sleep, but my mind was restless. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, filled with unseen things just beyond my sight. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. On the third day, the weather worsened. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. Snow fell hard and fast, piling up around the cabin until the door was almost blocked. The windows rattled in their frames. I stayed inside, feeling the pressure of the storm outside. The fire was the only thing keeping the cold at bay. I cooked more canned food and boiled water for coffee. The cabin felt smaller, tighter. The storm made the world outside disappear. It was just me and the wind, trapped in this old, creaking box in the middle of nowhere. I heard something that night, a knock on the door, soft, hesitant. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. Then nothing. I waited, tense, but no second knock came. I checked the windows again. No one outside. The snow was still falling heavily. I told myself it must have been the wind or a branch hitting the wood. But the sound was too deliberate, too steady to be random. I stayed awake longer, gripping the knife in my hand. Morning came with the storm still raging. I dug out the door, clearing the snow. Outside, the forest was transformed. Everything was buried under a thick white blanket. The tracks I had seen before were gone, wiped away. I went to the truck to check it, worried it might be stuck. The snow was deep, and the cold numbed my fingers as I brushed it off. The truck started, but I didn't try to leave. The road was impossible to see. That day, I stayed inside mostly. The storm made the cabin feel like a tiny island in a vast ocean of white. The fire was my anchor. I rationed my food carefully, boiling water and stacking more wood. The silence was broken only by the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin. At night, the knocking returned. Twice, soft and slow. My skin crawled every time. I locked the door and windows as tightly as I could. I didn't want to look outside. The fourth day passed the same. The storm weakened but didn't stop. The snow was still thick, the world outside a frozen wasteland. In the afternoon, I decided to check the perimeter, just a quick walk around the cabin to see if anything had changed. I wrapped myself in my warmest coat and stepped outside. The air was cold and still, the snow crunching underfoot. I noticed something odd near the edge of the clearing. Footprints leading away from the cabin into the trees. Fresh footprints made after the last snowfall. They were human, too big to be an animal. My heart sank. Someone had been here, close by. I followed the prints cautiously. They led into the thick forest, disappearing among the pines. I didn't want to follow them too far. The woods were dense, and the snow made every step harder. Still, I was curious. I turned back, uneasy but determined to stay alert. That night, the knocking came again. Louder, more insistent. My nerves were frayed. I sat by the stove, watching the door. The knock was steady, patient, like someone waiting for an answer. Suddenly, the door handle rattled. I jumped up, heart pounding. The door shook as if someone was trying to force it open. I grabbed my knife and pressed my back against the wall, staring at the door. Minutes passed, then silence. The wind died down too. I waited until dawn, not daring to sleep. The sky lightened, and I cautiously approached the door. Outside, the snow was undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of anyone. I checked the locks again, making sure everything was secure. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon, or something bigger. But the knocking, the rattling, that wasn't animal behavior. The next day, I packed my things. I couldn't stay here anymore. The isolation was worse than I thought, and the fear was eating me up. I cleared the snow off the road. The truck was buried but still functional. I started the engine and eased out onto the road. The tires slipped on ice and snow, but I kept control. As I drove away, I looked back once. The cabin stood silent among the trees, dark and still. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I was safe now, but I'd never forget the nights when I thought something real had been waiting just outside that door. Something patient and quiet, watching me from the shadows. The cabin was supposed to be my refuge, a place far away from the noise and chaos of the city, where I could rest and clear my mind. It was late September when I drove up the winding road that led into the dense forest of the northern woods. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the air had a crisp chill to it. The cabin sat nestled between tall pines and oaks, old but sturdy, built from thick logs that had weathered decades of storms. It smelled like wood and pine sap, with a faint hint of damp earth. I parked my car on the gravel driveway, feeling a strange calm settle over me. This was going to be a good break. The front porch creaked slightly as I stepped up. The wood was rough under my feet, worn smooth in places from years of use. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a stack of firewood nearby. The floorboards were scratched and scarred, but solid. Windows on three sides let in the pale afternoon light, filtering through the yellowing leaves outside. The air inside was cool but dry, a sharp contrast to the humid city air I'd left behind. I set my bags down and began to unpack slowly, feeling the weight of the week lift off me. The kitchen was small, with a cast iron stove, an old sink, and a wooden table with 4 chairs. I had brought food that wouldn't spoil: canned beans, rice, some dried fruit, a few fresh apples. I didn't plan to stay long, maybe 3 or 4 days, just enough time to read, write in my journal, and breathe. There was no cell phone signal out here, which was both a blessing and a curse. I wanted to disconnect, but part of me felt uneasy about being completely cut off. Still, the silence was deep and peaceful. At first, that's all I noticed. The silence, the rustle of leaves, the occasional bird call. That first night, I built a fire in the fireplace. The crackling flames threw flickering shadows on the rough wooden walls. I sat close, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug, watching the flames dance. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the windows, but inside, the cabin was warm and safe. I felt content. The next morning, I woke early to the faint pink light of dawn spilling through the curtains. The air smelled fresh, and I could hear the distant call of a woodpecker hammering at a tree. I dressed in layers: jeans, a flannel shirt, a thick jacket, and stepped outside. The forest was dense, the trees tall and close together, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a soft green glow. The ground was thick with pine needles and fallen leaves, damp from the early morning dew. I walked slowly down the path behind the cabin, trying to memorize the sounds and smells. I spent most of the day reading and writing. The journal was an old, leather-bound book I'd found at a used bookstore. I liked writing by hand, feeling the scratch of pen on paper. The cabin was quiet except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the wind in the trees. Around noon, I made myself a simple lunch: beans heated on the stove, a few slices of apple. The sun was warm through the windows, but I could feel the cold coming with the evening. That night, I went to bed early. The cabin was so quiet it almost felt unnatural. When the wind rustled the leaves, it sounded like whispers. I tried not to think about it, but as the hours passed, I began to notice small things: faint noises in the distance, the occasional snap of a twig just outside. My mind started to race with thoughts about animals or people nearby. I reminded myself that I was alone by choice, and there was no reason to be scared. On the third day, I decided to explore further. I packed a small backpack with water, a flashlight, some snacks, and my journal. The trail I took was narrow and overgrown, but clearly used by hunters or hikers. The forest grew thicker as I walked, and the sounds of civilization faded away completely. I noticed animal tracks, deer probably, and fresh scat. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and knotted. Occasionally, I would stop and listen, trying to catch any sounds of movement. But everything seemed still, peaceful. After about 2 hours, I found a small clearing. It was surrounded by tall pines, and the ground was soft with moss and fallen needles. The sunlight broke through in shafts, lighting up patches of the forest floor. I sat down to rest and pulled out my journal. Writing there, in that quiet spot, I felt a strange mixture of calm and alertness. The forest was beautiful, but there was an edge to it, a sense that I was being watched even if no one was there. As the sun began to lower, I made my way back. The trail seemed different in the fading light. Shadows stretched long and dark, and the temperature dropped quickly. I arrived at the cabin just as dusk turned to night. Inside, I lit the fireplace again and prepared a simple dinner. The warmth was comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. That night, the noises outside were louder: branches scraping against the cabin, distant thumps in the underbrush, the low call of an unknown animal. I lay awake for hours, listening, trying to pinpoint the source. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded, but I told myself it must be an animal, maybe a bear or a large dog. Still, the idea that someone could be outside unsettled me. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. Nothing seemed out of place. No footprints near the door, no signs of disturbance. The forest looked as peaceful as ever. I decided to stay inside that day, reading and writing. The isolation was starting to get to me. I realized how much I depended on the noise of the city, on people, on the distraction of screens and music. Here, alone with only the forest, my thoughts crowded in. I was beginning to feel vulnerable. On the fourth night, something changed. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something scraping at the side of the cabin. It was slow, deliberate, like nails or claws dragging across wood. I stayed perfectly still, my breath caught in my throat. The sound moved around the cabin, circling slowly, then stopped. I didn't dare move or make a sound. After a long moment, the noise faded away. I didn't sleep much after that. The fire had died down, and the room was cold. I sat in the dark, staring out the window into the blackness. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching like fingers. My mind played tricks on me, every shadow turning into a figure. I thought about packing up and leaving at dawn, but the road was long and the night was dark. The next morning, I found marks on the outside wall of the cabin, scratches, deep and fresh, running in irregular lines. They looked like they had been made by something sharp and strong. I touched them, feeling the roughness of the wood splinters. I tried to think of what could have done it. An animal? Person? Couldn't tell. But the thought of someone coming so close to my refuge made my skin crawl. I spent the day double-checking my supplies and making sure the doors and windows were locked tight. I stacked more wood near the fireplace, preparing for another cold night. The sun set slowly, turning the sky to orange and pink. I tried to keep busy, but my nerves were frayed. Every little noise sent me jumping. That night, I decided to keep the fire burning as long as possible. The warmth felt like a barrier against the dark outside. But around midnight, the noises began again. Scraping, shuffling, something moving close to the cabin walls. This time, the sound was accompanied by faint thuds, as if someone or something was trying to get in. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and held it tightly. I moved quietly to the window and peered out. The forest was black and empty. No movement, no shapes, nothing. I waited, frozen, for what felt like hours. Eventually, the sound stopped and silence returned. In the early morning, just before dawn, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on gravel near the driveway. I opened the door slowly and looked out. There was a man standing by my car, his back to me. He wore dark clothes and a cap, and he seemed to be looking at something on the ground. I didn't call out or move. Instead, I stepped back inside and locked the door quietly. I sat down and tried to calm my shaking hands. Who was he? How had he found me? The road was long and winding, not a place many people came. I thought about leaving immediately, but the man was still there, unmoving. After a while, he turned and walked slowly into the forest. I never saw him again. The next day, I packed everything and left. I didn't want to spend another night there. The cabin, once a peaceful refuge, had become a place of fear and uncertainty. The forest was beautiful and quiet, but it hid things. Maybe people, maybe wild animals, maybe just the loneliness and darkness inside my own mind. Driving away, I looked back once at the cabin. The air felt heavy the moment I pulled off the main road and onto the gravel path that led to the cabin. The sun was dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows that stretched over the land like dark fingers. I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A few days alone in the woods, away from the noise and stress of the city. The cabin was supposed to be a simple, quiet place where I could reset my mind and find some peace. What I didn't expect was how quickly the quiet would turn into something else entirely. The gravel crunched under my tires as I drove slowly down the narrow lane. Trees crowded on either side, their branches weaving overhead to form a rough canopy. I'd only seen pictures of the cabin before, but the real thing was even smaller and older than I'd imagined. It sat in a clearing no bigger than a football field, surrounded by thick forest. The walls were weathered, the wood gray and cracked, and the roof sagged a little in the middle. It looked forgotten, almost swallowed by the trees. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, listening. The only sounds were the rustle of wind through the leaves and distant birds settling down for the night. No traffic, no neighbors, no dogs barking, just silence. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, that feels alive. The cabin door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and old pine needles. The floorboards groaned beneath my boots, and a thin layer of dust covered the furniture. The place hadn't been used in a while, but it was cozy enough. There was a small kitchen with a rusty stove, a table with 2 rickety chairs, and a wood-burning fireplace. The bedroom was just a single room with a narrow bed and a cracked window that looked out onto the forest. I unpacked my things, stacking firewood by the door and lighting a small lantern on the table. The weak yellow light made the shadows flicker on the walls. I spent the first evening chopping wood, cleaning up the space, and making sure everything was in working order. I'd brought canned food and a small portable stove, but I wanted to try the fireplace. There was something comforting about the way the flames crackled and popped, casting warm orange light around the room. Outside, the wind picked up, making the trees sway and creak. As night fell fully, I noticed how dark it really was out here. With no streetlights or moonlight, the forest was a black wall pressing in on the clearing. The stars overhead were bright and countless, but they did little to push back the shadows below. I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and work. The mattress was thin and the blankets rough, but I slept well. When I woke the next morning, the sun was already shining through the window, warming the room. The forest outside looked peaceful, almost beautiful. I told myself everything was fine. The second day, I decided to explore the woods around the cabin. I had a map and compass, but mostly I wanted to wander and see what was out there. The trees were tall and close together, their trunks thick with moss. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. Occasionally, I spotted tracks, deer, maybe raccoons. The air smelled fresh, earthy. About an hour into the walk, I came across a narrow trail that seemed less traveled. I followed it deeper into the woods, curious where it led. The forest grew quieter, the sounds of birds fading. The light dimmed under the thick branches. After some time, the path ended at a small clearing with an old rusted metal barrel lying on its side. Nearby were scattered pieces of broken glass and twisted wire. It looked like someone had dumped trash here long ago. I didn't like the feeling it gave me, so I turned back. Back at the cabin, the late afternoon was spent gathering more firewood and preparing dinner. The quiet was a different kind now, more tense, like the forest was holding its breath. I brushed it off and focused on the small tasks. That night, I heard the first strange noises. Not ghosts or monsters, just real things that could be explained. Something was moving outside. Branches snapped and leaves rustled. I got up to check, lantern in hand, but saw nothing beyond the edge of the clearing. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper than before, and the night air was colder. I stayed inside, doors locked, fire burning low. The third day started gray and misty. A low fog hovered over the clearing, wrapping the cabin in a thick blanket. I felt isolated in a way I hadn't expected. The forest no longer seemed welcoming but watchful. I kept the fire going, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. Later, I went out to collect water from a nearby stream I'd spotted on the map. The ground was slippery from the dampness, and the fog made it hard to see far. As I bent down to fill my bottle, a sudden noise behind me made me freeze. A heavy thud followed by something dragging. I didn't turn around. Instead, I hurried back to the cabin, heart pounding. That night, I heard footsteps circling the cabin. They were heavy, deliberate, sometimes pausing. I stayed awake, watching the shadows dance on the walls. I told myself it was probably a wild animal or maybe a hunter passing nearby, but the sounds kept coming, closer each time. The fourth day, I decided I wouldn't stay longer. The isolation was starting to mess with me. I packed my things, ready to leave. But just as I was about to get in the car, I saw tire tracks in the dirt road, fresh, but not mine. Someone had been here. Panic set in. I looked around, trying to see if anyone was hiding in the trees. The forest was silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I got in the car and started driving back down the gravel path, but my headlights caught movement in the trees. A figure was standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, tall, still, watching me. I slammed the accelerator and didn't stop until I reached the main road. Back in the city, safe and surrounded by people, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The cabin trip was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but the woods held something else. Something real and dangerous, but no ghost stories, no fantasy. Just the kind of fear that comes when you know someone else is out there watching, waiting. I never went back to that cabin. The silence of the forest wasn't peaceful at all. It was a reminder that some places hide secrets that don't need monsters to be terrifying. The cabin stood just at the edge of the forest, a little more than a shack really, weathered by years of harsh winters and heavy rains. Its wood was dark, stained by time, and a thin layer of moss crept across the roof's shingles. I had driven past the place a dozen times, but never stopped, always busy with city life and the rush of work. But now, at the start of November, I wanted to get away for a while, just to clear my head. The city had become too loud, the people too many, and I craved silence. This cabin was my only option for a cheap weekend escape. A place where there was no internet, no phone signal, and no neighbors for miles. The air was already biting cold when I pulled into the gravel driveway. The crunch beneath my tires was sharp, almost painfully loud in the stillness. I shut off the engine and sat for a moment, looking out over the dense trees crowding the cabin on all sides. The sky was gray and heavy, like it was holding back snow. A cold wind brushed through the branches, sending dry leaves skittering across the ground. It was the kind of quiet that presses in on you, making every tiny noise feel like a shout. The front door creaked when I pushed it open. The smell hit me immediately. Musty wood, a faint trace of mold, and something else I couldn't quite place. It was old and stale, like the cabin hadn't been lived in for months, maybe years. Dust floated in the shafts of weak afternoon light, settling on every surface like a thin blanket. The floorboards creaked beneath my boots as I stepped inside. There wasn't much furniture, just a battered wooden table, 2 chairs, and a small wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. I dropped my bag near the door and walked to the window. Outside, the trees stood tall and unmoving, their branches stripped bare of leaves. I could see the gray sky bleeding into the horizon. There was no sign of life. No birds, no squirrels, not even the sound of wind through the treetops. Just the heavy stillness of a forest waiting for winter. I started unpacking slowly. I had brought a few canned foods, some bread, a small stove for cooking, and enough water for a couple of days. The cabin didn't have electricity, so I brought along a lantern and a box of matches. I filled a metal bucket from the well outside and set it near the stove. I figured I'd try to get a fire going, at least for heat and light once the sun went down. Outside, the sky darkened fast, slipping from gray to a dull blue, and then into night. I lit the lantern and sat down at the table, pulling out a notebook and a pen. I wanted to write to keep my mind busy and focused. The silence was getting heavier, though. It felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. At some point, maybe an hour after dark, I heard it, a faint rustling outside, just beyond the porch. I froze, listening. The wind was still, but the sound kept coming, soft and deliberate. It wasn't a branch breaking or an animal rushing through leaves. It was slower, more cautious, almost like someone was moving carefully through the trees. I stood and went to the window, pulling aside the curtain. The lantern light spilled across the porch, but the forest beyond was just shadows and shapes. I could see nothing clearly, but the rustling noise continued, now closer. My heart sped up. I didn't want to believe someone was out there, but the sound was too regular to be an animal. The cabin was supposed to be isolated, miles from any other homes or roads. Who would be wandering around in the woods at night? I thought about calling for help, but my phone had no signal. I considered grabbing a knife I kept in my backpack for camping, but I hesitated. I didn't want to be jumpy or paranoid. The rustling stopped suddenly, and the silence returned, thick and absolute. I sat back down and tried to steady my breathing. Maybe it was just a deer or some other animal, but a small voice in the back of my mind told me to stay alert. I tried to focus on my writing, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that sound. The wind picked up, and the trees began to groan softly as their branches scraped against each other. I heard the occasional snap of twigs from the forest, and every noise seemed amplified in the dark. Hours passed slowly. I tried to sleep but couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, the shadows outside seemed to shift and move, as if alive. I kept waking up to small noises, the creak of the floor, the rattle of the window frame in the wind, the soft thud of something outside. Around dawn, the rustling came back, this time louder and closer. I sat frozen on the chair, listening as footsteps crunching through dead leaves approached the porch. The sound stopped right outside the cabin door. My pulse hammered in my ears. Whoever or whatever it was standing there, waiting. I stared at the door, heart thudding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The wind was silent, and even the birds seemed to hold still. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. The footsteps shifted slightly, then retreated slowly back into the forest. As the first light of morning crept in, I dared to look outside again. The forest was empty, save for the mist rising off the ground. I stepped out onto the porch, my boots crunching on the frosty leaves. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. It was as if the footsteps had vanished into thin air. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I chopped some wood to keep the stove going, boiled water for coffee, and wandered around the clearing. The forest seemed peaceful in daylight, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled inside me. The feeling that someone or something had been there with me in the night, unseen but watching. That night, I stayed up until dawn. The lantern burned low, and I kept a knife close by. The rustling came again, but I forced myself to ignore it. When morning came, I packed up quickly, my nerves frayed and my skin cold despite the fire. Driving away from the cabin, I looked back one last time. The place looked innocent in the daylight, but I knew better. Something had been there with me, something real and human, not a ghost or fairy tale. Just a person lurking in the dark woods, silent and waiting. Back in town, I reported what happened to the local sheriff. They took notes but said it might have been hunters or trespassers. They told me to be careful if I went back. I didn't plan to. That trip stayed with me for a long time. The silence, the shadows, and the footsteps outside that cabin door reminded me that the real horror isn't ghosts or monsters. It's the people we don't see, the dangers hiding in the quiet places we think are safe. And sometimes, running away is the only way to survive. The wind was calm that evening when I first arrived at the cabin. The sky was clear, fading from pale blue to soft shades of orange and pink as the sun slowly sank behind the thick line of pines. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A quiet weekend away from the noise of the city, a chance to reset and breathe fresh air. The cabin itself sat alone at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by tall evergreens and wild brush. It was a modest place, built mostly of weathered wood that had turned gray with age. The porch sagged a little on one side, and a rusted metal swing hung from a thick branch of a tree nearby, swaying gently with the breeze. The gravel driveway crunched under the tires as I pulled the car to a stop. I sat for a moment listening. Nothing but the occasional call of a distant bird and the soft rustling of leaves. No cars, no people, just silence. I grabbed my backpack from the back seat and locked the car, feeling the familiar relief that comes with leaving the world behind, at least for a while. The cabin door was stubborn, creaking loudly as I pushed it open. Inside smelled of old wood, dust, and something faintly like pine sap. The place was empty except for the basics. A small table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, a couch with a few torn cushions, and a bed with a threadbare quilt. I set my bag down and took a slow walk around, running my hand over the rough wooden walls. There were cobwebs in the corners, and the floorboards groaned slightly underfoot. I liked it. It felt real and honest, nothing fancy or fake. I unpacked slowly. A few clothes, my camping stove, canned food, and a thermos of coffee. The sun slipped below the horizon as I stacked firewood near the stove and lit a small fire. Flames flickered and cast dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the forest darkened. I sat in the creaky old chair by the fire, the warmth pushing back the chill that had started to settle into the room. I opened a book, but after a few pages, my eyes kept drifting to the window, where the night had swallowed the clearing whole. It was then that I noticed a faint noise outside, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't the usual sounds of night, no birds or animals. This was something different, something slow and steady. I listened hard, trying to place it. It sounded like someone, or something, was knocking on the side of the cabin. My heart picked up pace, but when I looked out, there was nothing there. Just trees, standing still in the dark. I told myself it was probably just a branch tapping in the wind or maybe an animal brushing against the wood. Still, I made sure the door was locked tight. I sat back down and forced myself to read again, though the tapping came and went in the distance. I could feel my skin prickling, the quiet tension growing in the air. Around midnight, I went to bed, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The wind had picked up, and the branches scratched against the cabin, scraping and tapping like nails on wood. I pulled the quilt tight around me. The noises didn't stop. Every few minutes, I heard the slow knock, 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 soft but deliberate. Sleep was hard to come by. Every shadow seemed to move just out of sight. The wind's rhythm was irregular, sometimes calm, then loud and gusting, making the windows rattle. I kept my phone close, though there was barely any signal out here. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the thin curtains. The forest looked peaceful again, the trees golden with dawn light. I went outside to explore, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. The ground was damp with dew, and the smell of pine was sharp and clean. I walked the edge of the clearing, careful not to stray too far. Nothing seemed out of place, except for some strange marks on the ground near the cabin, small, round impressions, like someone had pressed a handful of stones into the dirt. I crouched down to examine them. They weren't animal tracks. They looked like deliberate impressions, maybe from the bottoms of heavy boots or a tool. I scanned the trees nearby but saw no footprints or other signs. The forest looked untouched and quiet. Back inside, I started to prepare breakfast. The kettle whistled softly on the stove. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that lingered from the night before. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. This place was isolated, sure, but it was also safe. As the day went on, I decided to do some chores around the cabin, stacking more firewood, clearing the porch of fallen leaves, and fixing the loose boards near the door. While working, I kept glancing toward the tree with the swing. It barely moved now, hanging still in the warm light. Late afternoon came, and with it, a sense of calm. I made coffee and sat on the porch swing, letting the warmth of the sun soak into my skin. I watched a pair of squirrels chase each other through the branches. The forest was alive but quiet in a good way. I started to relax. But then, as the sun began to lower, I heard it again. That slow knocking sound, soft but steady, coming from the back of the cabin. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked cautiously around to the other side. Nothing. No one, no animals. The back of the cabin faced a thick patch of woods, the trees standing too close to see far. The knocking came again, this time more clearly, like someone tapping a stick against the wood. I scanned the shadows but saw nothing moving. My skin prickled with the sudden chill of unease. I hurried back inside and locked all the windows and doors. For the rest of the evening, I kept the fire going bright, staying close to the stove, eyes fixed on the dark windows. The knocking never stopped completely, just softened and faded with the night. But I could still hear it faintly, like a secret rhythm echoing from the forest. The next day, I woke early and decided I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed quickly, double-checking the locks and shutting off the stove. The knocking hadn't come since dawn, but I didn't want to wait to find out if it would start again. As I drove away, I looked back at the cabin in the rearview mirror. The clearing was empty and quiet, but I knew that something had been there, something unseen that made the stillness feel heavy. I told myself it was probably just some strange wildlife behavior or the wind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew the forest had secrets, and I wasn't meant to be part of them. That weekend stayed with me long after I left the woods. I never found out exactly what made that knocking sound, but I didn't want to find out either. Some things, I figured, are better left unanswered. The cabin was just a place, but the feeling it gave me was real. A quiet warning hidden beneath the trees, waiting in the shadows for the next person to listen. I found the cabin through a last-minute online listing. It was a small, weathered place tucked deep in the woods, about 3 hours from the nearest town. I had been needing a break from everything: work, the noise, people, just a chance to clear my head in silence and solitude. The pictures online showed a modest, single-story cabin with peeling paint and a rusty metal roof. Nothing fancy, but it looked sturdy enough, and that was all I wanted. A quiet place to be alone for a week, with no distractions. I arrived late afternoon on a cool September day. The road leading to the cabin was little more than a dirt track lined by tall pines that blotted out most of the sky. The forest was dense, thick with undergrowth and fallen leaves. The smell of damp earth and pine resin filled the air. I parked my car in a small clearing next to the cabin. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the tires sunk slightly into the mud. The cabin looked exactly like the photos: small, square, with 2 windows on the front and a screen door that creaked when I pushed it open. Inside was a single room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove, and a narrow bed pushed against one wall. The floor was rough wood, dusty but clean enough. A few old cooking pots hung on hooks, and a pile of firewood sat neatly stacked near the stove. There was no electricity, no running water. The cabin relied entirely on the wood stove for heat, and the water had to be fetched from a nearby creek. I had brought bottled water for the first few days, but planned to use the creek for the rest. I liked the idea of being disconnected from everything: no internet, no phone signal, just me and the woods. After unpacking, I went outside to explore. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the trees. The forest around the cabin was quiet, almost too quiet. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird, but no other sounds. No cars, no planes, no other people. Just me and the woods. I found the creek about a 10-minute walk from the cabin. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth stones. I filled my water bottles, watching the small fish dart away as I scooped up the water. I thought about how easy it would be to get lost if I wasn't careful. There were no marked trails, just trees and uneven ground stretching in every direction. Back at the cabin, I built a small fire in the stove. The wood crackled and popped, the warmth spreading through the cold room. I cooked some canned beans and ate by the window, watching the sky darken. Soon the stars came out, bright and countless, untouched by city lights. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. The first night was quiet. I slept with the window slightly open to let in the cool night air. The wind whispered through the trees, and sometimes a branch would tap against the cabin's roof. I felt safe, more relaxed than I had in a long time. The next few days passed in a slow rhythm. I woke early, made coffee over the stove, and sat outside watching the morning mist curl through the trees. I spent hours reading, writing in my notebook, and walking in the woods. I kept careful track of where I went, leaving marks on trees and stones so I could find my way back. The forest was beautiful but wild. I saw deer tracks in the mud, squirrel nests in the branches, and sometimes the flash of a bird taking flight. One afternoon, I decided to explore farther. I followed the creek upstream, stepping carefully over rocks and fallen logs. The water grew colder and faster, rushing through a narrow ravine. The trees grew thicker here, the light dimmer. I kept a close eye on my marks, but after an hour, I realized I had wandered farther than I thought. The trees all looked the same, and the trail back was unclear. I stopped and looked around, trying to remember which way led to the cabin. The sun was low now, shadows growing long and deep. I felt a small prick of unease. I was alone out here, miles from help, and I hadn't planned to be out this late. I took a deep breath and began retracing my steps slowly. As I moved, I heard something ahead, a faint, rhythmic sound. It was too steady to be a bird or the wind. My heart sped up. I stopped behind a tree and listened. The sound grew louder, a dull thumping, like someone hammering or knocking on wood. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. The noise didn't sound human. It was too steady, mechanical almost. I shook my head, telling myself it must be some kind of animal or the sound of the wind through a hollow log. Still, the sound put me on edge. I moved cautiously, staying low, until the noise faded behind me. When I finally found the creek again, the sun had almost disappeared. I hurried back to the cabin, the darkness closing around me like a thick blanket. The forest felt different now, less friendly, more mysterious. I was aware of every crackling twig, every shifting shadow. My hands trembled slightly as I lit the stove and closed all the windows tightly. That night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept hearing noises outside, branches scraping, something moving just beyond the window. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a raccoon or a fox, but the sounds were different. Sometimes it sounded like heavy footsteps circling the cabin. In the morning, I found marks on the cabin door, scratches, deep and rough, like claws or nails digging into the wood. I hadn't noticed them before. My stomach tightened. I checked the perimeter carefully but found no footprints or signs of anyone nearby. I spent the next days extra cautious. I kept the fire burning day and night for light and warmth. I stayed close to the cabin, not wanting to wander too far. I kept my phone charged in case of emergency, even though there was no signal out here. The forest, which had felt peaceful at first, now felt like a trap. On the fourth day, I decided to check the creek again. The water was lower now, the coolness less sharp. As I filled my bottles, I saw something that stopped me cold. A set of footprints in the mud, fresh and deep, leading from the water's edge into the trees. They were too large and heavy to be deer or any small animal. I followed the prints a short distance but lost them in the thick underbrush. My heart pounded. Whoever had made those prints was close, and they had been here recently. Back at the cabin, I checked the windows and doors, tightening the locks as best I could. The cabin was old, with weak hinges and thin walls. I wished I had brought a gun or at least a strong flashlight. That night, the noises returned louder. Scraping, thumping, heavy breathing just outside. I stayed in the corner by the stove, clutching a large stick I'd found outside. Hours passed with no sign of anyone entering, but I felt watched. The next morning, I found more scratches, this time on the walls, near the windows. They looked desperate, angry. I realized whoever or whatever was out there had been trying to get inside. I spent the entire day inside, barely moving. I didn't go outside except once to grab more firewood, rushing back inside as fast as I could. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Someone hiding in the woods, waiting to attack, or worse. On the sixth day, I woke early to a loud banging on the door. My heart stopped. I held the stick tightly and waited. The banging stopped after a moment, replaced by silence. I peered through the window but saw nothing. No footprints in the mud, no sign of anyone. The forest was still, quiet as before. I sat down, trembling. That afternoon, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly and prepared to leave. The dirt road back to the highway was slippery and uneven, but I had to get out. As I drove away, the forest faded behind me, the cabin becoming just a small dot in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back. Weeks later, I learned from a ranger that the area had been the site of illegal logging and poaching, with dangerous people sometimes lurking in the woods. It made sense, the sounds, the footprints, the scratches. It wasn't ghosts or monsters, just humans who didn't want visitors. The experience changed me. I realized that the wilderness isn't always peaceful or safe. Sometimes the scariest thing is knowing there are others out there, watching, waiting, hidden in the shadows. I'm grateful to be home now, safe and far away from that cabin in the woods. The silence I sought turned into a warning I'll never forget. I had been looking forward to the weekend for weeks. The idea of leaving the noise and rush of the city behind and retreating to a remote cabin in the woods was something I needed badly. I had booked the place online through a small rental website, a simple wooden cabin far from any town, deep in the forest near a large lake. The photos showed a charming, rustic cabin surrounded by tall pines and the lake reflecting the clear blue sky. It seemed perfect, the kind of place where I could relax, read a book, hike, and just breathe fresh air. The drive there was longer than I expected. I had to take a narrow, winding gravel road that seemed to get worse the further I went. The car rattled and bounced, and at times I worried about getting stuck. But eventually, after a couple of hours, I pulled up to the cabin. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. The wooden walls were weathered but sturdy, and smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney. The place had no electricity, which was fine by me. I wanted to disconnect. I took my bags inside and set them down by the front door. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and old wood, with a faint hint of dampness from the forest. The room was simple: a small kitchen area with a wood stove, a rough wooden table, a few chairs, and a bed tucked into the corner with a thick quilt. I spent the first afternoon unpacking and walking around the area. The forest was dense and quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive with the sound of insects and distant birds, but no human voices. The lake was just a short walk through the trees, its surface smooth and dark. The air smelled fresh and clean, felt peaceful and safe. I stacked some dry wood by the stove and lit a small fire to warm the cabin. The flames crackled and the warmth spread quickly. I cooked a simple meal over the stove and ate while watching the fire dance in the small hearth. Afterward, I settled into bed early, tired from the long drive. That first night, I slept well enough, though I woke once or twice to strange sounds outside. The rustling of leaves, maybe an animal moving through the brush. I reminded myself it was normal in the woods and went back to sleep. The next day, I planned to explore more. I packed a small backpack with water, some snacks, a flashlight, and my phone, though I didn't expect any signal out here. The forest stretched thick around the cabin, and I followed a rough trail that led deeper into the trees. The ground was soft beneath my feet, covered in pine needles and fallen leaves. Birds called somewhere high above, but I saw no one else. As I walked, I noticed how the forest seemed to close in. The trees grew closer together, blocking the sunlight until the air grew cooler and dimmer. The trail twisted and turned, sometimes disappearing under fallen branches. I had to stop and look carefully to find the way. After an hour, I came to a small clearing with a narrow stream trickling through it. I took a break here, sitting on a moss-covered rock, watching the water swirl over stones. It was peaceful, but I noticed how quiet it had become. The birds stopped calling. Even the wind seemed to die down. An uneasy feeling crept in, like I was being watched. I stood up and scanned the trees around me. Nothing moved. I shook the feeling off, reminding myself I was alone and safe. Still, I didn't linger. I turned back toward the cabin, sticking to the trail. That evening, as the sun dropped low, I made another fire in the stove. I cooked and ate while reading a paperback book I'd brought along. The firelight flickered on the walls, casting long shadows. Outside, the woods grew darker and colder. I checked my phone again. No signal as expected. I told myself I wouldn't need it here. Later, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. A sound outside. Something soft, scraping or scratching at the cabin. I froze, listening hard. It was faint but definite. I stayed still for a long time, straining to hear more, but the noise stopped. Maybe it was a branch brushing the wall or an animal. Still, I felt my heart quicken. I had left the windows open during the day, but now I closed them tightly. The next morning, I found fresh scratches on the wood near the back door. Thin, deep marks like claws. I hadn't seen any animals big enough to do that. The nearest bear sighting had been miles away, according to the ranger's pamphlet in the cabin. I thought about telling someone, but I was alone and out of range. I felt a flicker of worry, but tried to focus on the day ahead. I decided to explore the lake more. I packed a lunch and walked down to the water's edge. The lake was bigger than I thought, stretching far into the distance, surrounded by forested hills. The The surface was calm, reflecting the gray sky. I found a small dock, old and creaky, barely holding together. I sat there, dangling my feet over the edge and watching a few ducks paddle in the distance. The peace didn't last long. As I sat, I heard a snapping sound from the woods behind me. Branches breaking, footsteps crunching on dead leaves. I turned quickly, heart pounding. The trees seemed still, but I knew I wasn't alone. The feeling returned, that sharp, cold sense that someone or something was watching me. I got up and hurried back to the cabin, eyes scanning the treeline. Back at the cabin, I locked the doors and windows and checked all the wood. The scratches were worse now. Deep gouges near the back and side doors, some almost like someone tried to pry the wood open. I found broken twigs and crushed leaves nearby, as if someone had moved quickly through the brush. My stomach tightened with fear. I wanted to call the ranger or the local sheriff, but I had no signal. That night was restless. Every small noise, the wind rattling the trees, the hoot of an owl, the creak of the cabin settling, made me jump. I kept the fire burning longer than usual. The scratches outside seemed closer now, more frequent, almost like someone was pacing or circling the cabin. I barely slept. When morning came, I felt tense and exhausted. I decided not to explore more, to stay close to the cabin until I could leave. I started packing my things, hoping to drive back to town later that day. But as I packed, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the dirt near the cabin. Not animal prints, human. They were large, heavy, and fresh. Someone had been here in the night. Fear gripped me. I checked the windows and doors, all still locked and intact. Whoever had been here had stayed out of sight. I realized I might not be alone at all. The isolation I had wanted suddenly felt dangerous. I gathered my bags quickly, planning to leave right after breakfast. I was careful not to make noise. When I stepped outside, I saw more signs. Broken branches, flattened grass, and more footprints leading into the woods. I debated what to do. Calling for help would be useless with no signal, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I decided to get into the car and drive carefully back down the gravel road, watching the forest closely. As I started the engine, I heard a noise from behind the cabin. A soft but deliberate knock on the wood. I froze, then silence. My hands gripped the wheel tight. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the trees hid everything. I backed out slowly, eyes on the road and the woods. The cabin disappeared behind me as I drove down the winding path, my heart pounding, every sound amplified. The drive back was tense. I kept looking in the mirrors and at the trees, feeling like eyes followed me. I stayed on the gravel, avoiding any shortcuts through the forest. When I finally reached the paved road and the first gas station, I stopped and called the local sheriff. I explained what I had found, the scratches, the footprints, the noises. They promised to send someone out to check the cabin. A few days later, I got a call from the sheriff. They had gone to the cabin and found evidence of recent human presence. Footprints, broken branches, some food wrappers left behind. No one was found, but it was clear someone had been living or hiding near the cabin without my knowledge. The area was known for occasional squatters or people hiding from the law. The sheriff advised me not to return to the cabin alone. They said it was too dangerous without backup. Looking back, I realized how naive I had been to think the woods were just peaceful and quiet. The silence can hide many things, and isolation can leave you vulnerable. I had escaped without harm, but the experience left a mark on me. The feeling of being watched, the unexplained scratches and footsteps, and the knowledge that someone else had been so close without my knowing made me respect the wilderness differently. Now, I stick to busy campsites and places with cell service. The idea of a quiet cabin in the middle of nowhere still sounds appealing, but I know the risks. Some places are not as safe as they seem, and sometimes the scariest things are the ones you don't see. The people who stay hidden in the shadows, waiting. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet escape, a few days away from the noise of the city, away from everything and everyone. That's what I told myself when I drove down the long dirt road, my car kicking up dust as it bumped over potholes and gravel. The trees were thick on both sides, their branches creating a dense canopy that blocked the afternoon sun from reaching the ground. I felt the tension in my shoulders ease just a little with every mile I put behind me. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow path, surrounded by tall pines and old oaks. It looked small and weathered, the wood darkened by years of rain and sun. The windows were dusty, the paint peeling in places, but it still held a kind of charm. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool and smelled like old wood and something faintly musty. The floorboards creaked underfoot. I dropped my bags on the floor and let out a long breath. I didn't expect the place to be clean. I knew I'd have to do some work, sweeping, dusting, maybe even fixing a few things. The furniture was sparse. A worn-out couch, a rickety wooden table with a few chairs, a small stove in the corner. There was a stack of firewood by the door, and a rusty old axe leaned against the wall. I unpacked my supplies, setting out canned food, water bottles, matches, and a flashlight. I had packed lightly. No internet, no TV, no phone signal. Just me and the woods. At first, the days passed in a slow, comfortable rhythm. I woke early with the light, brewing coffee on the stove while the sun filtered through the curtains. I walked around the property, noting how wild the forest had grown around the cabin. The trees seemed to lean in closer each day, their shadows stretching longer as the sun dipped lower. I found a small creek nearby, its water clear and cold. I filled my bottles and soaked my feet in the cool stream. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. But as the sun set each evening, the silence started to feel heavier. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind that presses in and makes your skin crawl. I lit a fire in the stove, watching the flames flicker and cast strange shadows on the walls. The darkness outside was absolute. No streetlights, no passing cars. Just the forest, black and endless. The first night, I slept fitfully. Every crack and pop from the old cabin sounded amplified in the quiet. The wind rattled the windows, and sometimes I thought I heard something moving outside. But when I looked out, there was nothing but trees and dark shapes. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe an animal. On the second day, I decided to explore deeper into the woods. The trees grew thicker, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. I followed a narrow trail I hadn't noticed before. It twisted and turned, and I felt the weight of the forest pressing in around me. Birds were quiet here, and even the wind seemed muffled. I stopped a few times to listen, my heart beating a little faster. The trail ended abruptly at a clearing. In the center stood an old hunting stand, tall and rickety, with faded paint and broken steps. I looked around and noticed old footprints in the dirt, some fresh, some older. The thought of someone else being nearby unsettled me. I scanned the trees, but saw no one. I took a deep breath and headed back, my eyes always flicking over my shoulder. That night, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I sat by the fire, flashlight in hand, eyes darting to every shadow. I tried to read a book, but the words blurred. The silence was suffocating. At some point, I heard a distant sound, something like footsteps crunching on leaves far away. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. The third day brought strange things. I found my firewood pile disturbed. Logs shifted as if someone had handled them. I was careful with the axe, but now it was lying on the ground a few feet from the pile. I hadn't left it there. Cold knot formed in my stomach. I searched the perimeter, but there were no footprints or signs of a person near the cabin. The woods were dense, but I felt like something was close. I spent the afternoon cleaning and repairing a few broken windows, nailing wooden planks over the cracks to keep the cold air out. The sun was low when I finished, and the sky turned pink and purple behind the trees. The forest seemed to grow darker faster now, the shadows thicker. I lit the stove again and sat close to the fire, staring at the flickering flames. That night was worse. Couldn't sleep. Every noise was louder than before. Branches scraping the cabin walls, soft thuds on the roof. I stayed awake, gripping the flashlight tightly, my ears straining for any sound. At one point, I thought I heard whispering, so faint it might have been my imagination, but it sent a shiver down my spine. The wind had died, and the forest was eerily still. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and waited for morning. The next day, I found more signs someone had been near. The back door, which I had locked carefully, was slightly ajar. There were smudges on the windows where someone's hands had pressed. I searched the area around the cabin but found no footprints or other evidence. It was like whoever it was had slipped in and out without leaving a trace. I knew I shouldn't stay. The feeling in my gut was screaming at me to leave. But the car was stuck, somewhere near the entrance of the dirt road. The engine wouldn't start. I didn't have cell service to call for help. I was trapped. I spent the day trying to fix the car with the little I knew. The frustration mounted as the sun sank lower. The forest around me felt like it was closing in. That night, I stayed inside, sitting by the fire with the axe close at hand. Every noise felt amplified. At some point, I heard footsteps crunching just outside. I froze, listening. The sound stopped abruptly. I waited, heart pounding, but nothing else came. Morning brought relief. The first rays of sun burned away the shadows and the cold. I decided to walk to the main road, hoping to find help. The hike was harder than I expected, the woods thick and wild. I kept looking back, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was no one. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the road. A car passed by and I flagged it down. The driver was kind and agreed to help me get my car started. When we returned, the engine roared to life immediately. Relief flooded me. I packed quickly, not wanting to waste any time. As I drove away, I looked back once. The cabin sat quietly among the trees, its shadows shrinking in the morning light. The forest was just a forest. No ghosts, no monsters, just the deep, endless woods and the memory of a few uneasy nights. I was glad to leave it behind. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was a reminder of how small and vulnerable you can feel when you're alone in the dark, with nothing but your own thoughts and the rustling trees. I promised myself I wouldn't come back. Sometimes, escaping isn't about finding peace, but about recognizing when a place holds too many secrets you don't want to uncover. The cabin was one of those places for me. It was a lesson in respect for the wilderness and the limits of solitude. And sometimes that's enough. I didn't plan for the trip to go the way it did. What started as a quiet weekend getaway to a remote cabin turned into one of the most tense, unsettling experiences I've ever had. The kind of experience that stays with you, not because something fantastic happened, but because it felt so real and close. I'm going to try and tell everything exactly as I remember it, with all the small details that made me so uneasy, because I think those details are important to understand why I felt like I did, and how I made it through. It was late October when I drove out to the cabin, a place I found online. The pictures looked peaceful, old wooden logs, surrounded by tall pine trees, sitting beside a small lake. It was advertised as a private place, far from towns and noise, perfect for disconnecting from work and the city. I had a week off and I wanted nothing more than to be alone, to read, think, and relax. No phone, no internet, no distractions. The drive took me several hours. I left early in the morning before sunrise so I could arrive just before dark. The weather was cool, crisp, typical for fall, with leaves turning orange and brown. As I got closer, the road became narrower, turning into gravel, twisting through the forest. The trees towered above me, branches thick with needles, making it darker even during the day. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was setting, low behind the trees. The air smelled like pine and wet earth. The cabin looked just like in the pictures. 2 stories, rough logs, a stone chimney, windows dim from the inside. I pulled up to a small dirt driveway and turned off the engine. For a moment, I just sat there, listening. Nothing but the wind moving through the branches, the occasional call of a crow. It felt like stepping into a different world. I got out, dragging my bag behind me. The porch creaked under my feet as I walked up the steps and pushed open the door. Inside, the cabin was cool and smelled faintly of old wood and dust. I flicked on the lights. There was electricity, but no cell signal, as promised. The room was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace, a wooden table, a few chairs, and a couch covered with a wool blanket. A small kitchen was tucked to one side, and stairs led up to a loft bedroom. I dropped my bag and went straight to the windows. Outside, the lake was a flat mirror reflecting the last orange light of the sky. The forest surrounded it, dense and dark. I thought about how quiet it was, how far from anything I was. No cars, no people, no sound except nature. I spent the evening unpacking, lighting a fire in the fireplace, and preparing a simple dinner. The cabin had a wood stove, which was a bit tricky to get going, but eventually, I had the room warmed and glowing. I pulled out a book I had brought, one of those thick paperbacks with no pictures, the kind you get lost in. But after a while, my mind started wandering. I noticed the silence again, the kind that feels heavy, almost like a weight pressing down. At night, I tried to sleep, but the darkness felt different than in the city. I was used to hearing distant sirens or the hum of traffic. Here, the only sounds were natural. The wind in the trees, the occasional snap of a branch, the soft lapping of water at the lake shore. But there was something else, something I couldn't place. A subtle feeling like being watched or not alone. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, or the isolation getting to me. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I had a map the cabin owner provided, but it was hand-drawn and a bit vague. The forest was thick, the ground covered with leaves and pine needles. The air smelled fresh but damp from last night's rain. I walked along a narrow trail by the lake, stepping carefully over roots and stones. Birds flitted through the trees, their chirps breaking the silence. After a few hours, I found an old dock, weathered and falling apart. It stretched a few feet into the water, which was clear and cold. I sat down, dangling my feet, watching the tiny ripples. It was peaceful, but the feeling of unease never fully left me. I checked my watch. It was still early afternoon, but the sky was growing cloudier, dull gray blocking out the sun. I headed back to the cabin, planning to start a fire and make some tea. When I reached the porch, something caught my eye. A set of footprints in the dirt near the edge of the driveway. They looked fresh, like someone had walked there recently. I paused, staring at them, trying to figure out where they led. The prints went off toward the trees, disappearing into the thick underbrush. My heart sped up a little. I told myself maybe the cabin owner or a ranger had stopped by. This area wasn't completely closed off. Sometimes hunters or hikers passed through. Still, I hadn't heard any cars or seen anyone. I looked around carefully, but the forest seemed still and empty. That night, the wind picked up. The cabin's windows rattled softly, and the branches scratched against the walls. I kept the fire burning bright and sat close to it, reading my book but hardly able to focus. Every sound felt amplified. The creak of the old wood, the snap of a twig outside, the soft thump of something against the cabin wall. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. Something outside the cabin caught my attention. I couldn't see through the dark windows, but I heard the faint crunch of leaves and twigs. It wasn't loud, but steady, deliberate, like someone was walking around the cabin, slowly, carefully. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the way the sound moved made me feel otherwise. It circled the cabin once, maybe twice. My stomach knotted. I stayed as still as possible, listening, trying not to make any noise. After what felt like an hour, the sound stopped. The forest went completely silent again. I waited a while longer, then slowly got up to check the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was still secure. No signs of forced entry or damage. I tried to sleep, but the tension didn't go away. I kept imagining footsteps outside, shadows moving in the trees. The isolation felt different now, less peaceful and more threatening. The following morning, I decided to explore further, hoping the fresh air and exercise would clear my mind. I took a small backpack with water, snacks, a flashlight, and a pocket knife I always carried just in case. I followed a different trail, one leading uphill into thicker forest. The trees here were older and taller, their trunks covered in moss. The ground was damp and soft underfoot, with fallen leaves hiding roots and stones. I walked slowly, eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. About an hour into the hike, I found a narrow clearing. It was small, maybe 20 feet across, surrounded by thick bushes and trees. In the middle stood a makeshift shelter, something built from branches and tarps, old and torn. It looked like someone had stayed there recently, or at least tried to. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't on the map, and I hadn't expected anyone else to be that close. I looked around carefully. There were scraps of food wrappers, a few empty cans, and some cigarette butts. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing through. I took a deep breath and turned back toward the cabin. I didn't want to stay out longer than necessary. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than before. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something else. Small marks on the porch steps, like scratches, fresh and deliberate. I touched them lightly, my fingers trembling. Whoever was nearby was close enough to leave these signs, maybe even watching me. I debated whether to leave right then, but the nearest town was still hours away, and I had no cell service to call for help. I told myself I'd stay calm and wait for morning. That night, the noises outside returned. Not just footsteps, but faint voices carried by the wind. I couldn't make out the words, just low murmurs, like people talking quietly behind the trees. The sounds circled the cabin again and again, never getting closer but never leaving either. I stayed by the fire all night, clutching the pocket knife, eyes darting to the windows every few seconds. The wind was cold, making the flames flicker wildly. I kept my phone close, even though I knew it wouldn't connect. At dawn, the forest finally fell silent. I stepped outside cautiously. The sun was weak behind gray clouds, but it was enough light to see clearly. No footprints, no shelter, no signs of anyone else. It was as if whoever had been there had vanished. I packed quickly, collecting all my things, lighting the stove one last time to boil water. I didn't want to stay any longer. The peaceful weekend I imagined was gone. On the drive back, I kept glancing at the side of the road, half expecting to see someone hiding in the trees. The forest seemed darker, more menacing, as if it held secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. When I finally reached the highway and got a signal, I called a friend and told them I was safe. I realized how lucky I was to get away without any real harm. The experience left me shaken but clear-headed. I understood now how isolation can make ordinary things frightening, how the presence of others, even if unseen, the dense forest around the cabin was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like the whole world was holding its breath. I had driven for hours, winding through narrow, unmarked roads until the GPS signal finally faded out, leaving me with nothing but the directions scribbled on a piece of paper from the rental agency. The cabin was supposed to be a weekend retreat, a break from the city noise, the constant buzz of people and traffic. It was advertised as remote and peaceful. That part was true. The problem was, I hadn't realized just how far out I was going until I pulled up on a gravel path surrounded by towering pines. The cabin itself was small, built from rough-cut logs that looked like they had been there for decades. It had a little porch with a sagging wooden bench and a rusty lantern hanging by the door. The windows were dusty and dark, reflecting the thick forest behind me like black mirrors. I grabbed my bag and the cooler, locked the car behind me, and started toward the door. The silence pressed in with every step, the crunch of pine needles underfoot loud enough to remind me I was alone. I felt the weight of the forest watching me. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and cold air. The floor creaked under my boots as I set my things down. There was a small kitchen with a propane stove and a sink, though the water wasn't running. A rough wooden table sat in the corner, its surface scarred and worn. A couch with a torn armrest faced a stone fireplace, blackened from years of use. I pulled the curtains aside to let some light in, and the sun was dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the floor. I unpacked slowly, trying to shake the feeling that I had stepped into a place that time forgot. The phone had no signal, and the radio only caught static. I set up my sleeping bag on the floor and laid out my food and supplies. The plan was simple: relax, hike a bit, maybe read, and then sleep early. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, but as the sky darkened and the woods outside turned into a wall of black shapes, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Night came fast, faster than I expected in that place. The forest seemed alive with sounds I couldn't place. The snap of twigs, distant rustling, the low, steady thrum of something moving just out of sight. I lit a few candles, but they did little to cut the shadows that clung to the corners of the cabin. The fire in the hearth was dead. There was no dry wood for a fire, just old logs and kindling that looked too damp. The cold seeped through the walls, making me pull my jacket tighter around me. I decided to check the windows again. The glass was grimy and streaked with dirt and rain, and outside, the trees stood like silent giants, their branches clawing at the sky. I thought I saw a movement, just the corner of my eye catching something shifting behind the trees. But when I looked directly, there was nothing but darkness. I tried to read to distract myself, but the words on the pages blurred as my mind kept drifting back to the forest. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees, and a sudden loud crack made me jump. It sounded like a branch breaking, or maybe a tree falling somewhere nearby. My heart hammered in my chest. I kept telling myself it was just the woods, nothing more. I crawled into my sleeping bag on the floor, but sleep wouldn't come. Every small noise startled me. The forest outside felt like it was pressing in closer, filling every crack and crevice of the cabin. At one point, I heard what sounded like footsteps crunching in the leaves just beyond the porch. I sat up, holding my breath, straining to see in the pitch-black night. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned. I convinced myself it was a deer or some animal wandering near. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost all meaning in that cabin. I kept listening, every sound amplified. At some point, I dozed off, only to wake to the faintest tapping on the window. I froze, the sound barely audible but clear enough to make my skin crawl. The tapping came again, slow and deliberate. I didn't dare move, just stared at the dark glass, willing myself to see whatever was there. But there was nothing. The wind was still. The woods held their breath again. Morning couldn't come soon enough. When the sun finally started to rise, the cabin was filled with a weak, pale light that barely warmed the chill inside. I opened the door and stepped outside. The forest looked innocent in daylight, trees swaying softly in the breeze, birds calling overhead. The ground around the porch was disturbed, footprints, but not animal ones. Human footprints, messy and smeared in the dirt, leading away into the thick woods. Fear hit me hard. I wasn't alone here after all. I grabbed my bag and started down the path toward the car, eyes glued to every shadow and movement. The forest felt different now, darker somehow, as if it was hiding things just out of sight. I kept hearing sounds, low growls, branches snapping, something heavier moving through the brush. The footprints kept appearing and disappearing on the dirt trail, always ahead of me, like something was walking just beyond my vision. Picked up my pace, heart racing. The cabin disappeared behind the trees, and the silence came crashing back, heavier this time. I reached my car and locked the doors, the engine roaring to life with a shaky hand. As I pulled onto the road, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a shadow among the trees, standing still, watching. It was too tall and too still to be an animal. The drive back was tense, every turn and bump making me jump. I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see that figure again, but the trees stayed empty behind me. When I finally hit the highway, the rush of cars and the sound of city life was overwhelming. The forest was behind me, but its silence and darkness lingered in my mind. Back in my apartment, safe and warm, I unpacked the cooler and found a small, weathered notebook tucked inside. Hadn't been mine. The pages were filled with strange, hurried notes about the forest, about people who had disappeared, and warnings about staying too long. The last page was torn out, but the scrawled words that remained chilled me. They watch from the trees. You're never alone. I never went back to that cabin. I told no one exactly where it was. The forest had secrets, real and dangerous. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I hear the tapping again, echoing in the silence, reminding me I was never truly alone out there.